Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're diving deep into the golden sands of time, into a world of pharaohs, gods, and secrets that have somehow survived thousands of years, even when most of what we know about them is completely wrong. So, before we unravel the truth behind totally wrong Egyptian myths everyone still believes today, take a second to hit that like button. And if you love stories that blend mystery, history, and a little bit of midnight magic, subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a night with us. Now, settle in, dim the lights, maybe grab a warm drink, because tonight we're heading back to the land of the Nile, a place where myths were carved in stone, gods walked beside men, and the truth has been buried, sometimes quite literally, beneath layers of sand and centuries of misunderstanding. Let's begin. Tonight, we're stepping into the land of golden sands, towering pyramids, and myths that have travelled thousands of years to reach us. Egypt is a place that almost everyone thinks they understand, even if they've never been there. The problem is, most of what we believe about ancient Egypt is, well, completely wrong. You've probably seen it in movies, read it in textbooks, or heard it from someone quoting ancient facts without a single source. But tonight, we're going to strip away those layers of misunderstanding and take a closer look at what Egypt really was, who its people really were, and how the stories we tell today have been twisted by centuries of imagination, misinterpretation, and sometimes pure fantasy. Let's start with the image that comes to mind for most people, the pyramids. Towering, majestic, mysterious. Everyone pictures slaves, whips, and chains, forced into labour under the unforgiving Egyptian sun. You might even hear phrases like, built by the hands of millions of enslaved workers. It's a seductive image, painful, dramatic, and tragic. Hollywood loves it, history textbooks have repeated it, and it's easy to imagine. But here's the truth. The pyramids were not built by slaves, at least not in the way most people imagine. Archaeologists have spent decades studying the workers' villages near Giza, and what they've found paints a very different picture. These were highly skilled labourers, paid in food, beer, and respect. Their villages were organised with bakeries, breweries, and medical care. Graffiti left behind in the quarries shows pride, not misery, in the work they did. These men were not captives. They were craftsmen and labourers, part of a workforce that took immense pride in building monuments meant to last for eternity. The story of the slave-built pyramids is a modern myth, born from the imagination of Greek historians, sensational European explorers, and later, filmmakers looking for drama. In reality, the pyramid builders were respected and well cared for members of society, and they knew their work would be remembered forever, and it was. But the pyramids are just the beginning. Ancient Egypt is filled with stories we've been telling ourselves for centuries that are, in most cases, wildly inaccurate. Take the pharaohs, for example. Many of us picture them as tyrannical god-kings, ruling with absolute power over legions of terrified subjects. That image is partly true, but it's also simplified and misleading. Pharaohs were seen as divine, yes, but their divinity was less about omnipotence and more about order. They were the living embodiment of Ma'at, the principle of balance, truth, and cosmic order. Their power was both spiritual and political, designed to maintain harmony in a world that ancient Egyptians saw as delicate and constantly threatened by chaos. Even the gods themselves have been misunderstood. We've been told that Egyptians worshipped cats, crocodiles, or the sun itself. It's easier to imagine these exotic symbols as objects of blind worship, but the truth is far more nuanced. Cats, for instance, were revered because they protected food stores from rats and snakes. They were sacred symbols of protection, not literal gods you had to kneel to every morning. The crocodile god Sobek was worshipped not out of fear, but as a way to respect the power and danger of the Nile itself, a source of life and death. And the sun? Egyptians didn't worship light. They worshipped the cycles, the rhythms, the cosmic balance that the sun represented. The gods were not caricatures or monsters. They were representations of forces, ideas, and principles that shape the universe and human life within it. And then there's Cleopatra. She's probably one of the most misrepresented figures in history. Most people see her as a seductress who used her beauty to manipulate Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, a woman defined entirely by romance and scandal. But Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian. She was Macedonian Greek, descended from the Ptolemaic dynasty that came to power after Alexander the Great. She was highly educated, multilingual, and politically astute. She could speak 9 languages and navigated one of the most complex political landscapes in history. Her reputation as a femme fatale is more a product of Shakespeare, Roman propaganda and Hollywood than historical reality. Cleopatra was a leader, a strategist, and a diplomat, far more remarkable for her intellect than her looks. And the myths of death and curses, the fascination with mummies and tombs, are another area where the truth has been obscured by imagination. The so-called mummy's curse is largely a 20th century invention, fueled by media sensationalism after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Newspapers wrote stories of people dying mysteriously after entering the tomb, linking them to ancient magic. But the real reasons for these deaths were mundane: bacteria, viruses, and coincidence. Egyptians did care deeply about the afterlife, but their focus was on preservation, spiritual continuity, and honouring ancestors, not creating terrifying curses to ward off looters. Even Egyptian writing, the hieroglyphs, have contributed to our misconceptions. Early translators like Champollion unlocked the Rosetta Stone, but misinterpretations and simplifications have persisted. Some symbols were read literally when they were metaphorical, some texts were taken out of context, and much of the nuance in religious, administrative, and personal writings was lost in translation. Every time we read about Egypt in simplified terms, we lose a little more of the reality, the texture, and the depth of the civilization itself. So why do these myths persist? Partly because they are easier to understand than the truth. It's simpler to imagine slaves building pyramids than to grasp a complex system of paid, skilled labour. It's more dramatic to picture Cleopatra as a temptress than as a brilliant leader navigating deadly politics. Myths sell books, movies, and tours. They feed our appetite for the exotic, the mysterious, and the sensational. But the real Egypt, the one buried beneath these misconceptions, is richer, more fascinating, and far more human. When we start looking at Egypt through a lens free of exaggeration, we begin to see a civilization that was brilliant, creative, and incredibly sophisticated. They developed advanced medical practices, understood astronomy to a remarkable degree, created a system of writing and record-keeping that allowed complex administration over centuries, and produced art that still captivates us today. Every temple, statue, and tomb tells a story of people striving to understand their world, to preserve their knowledge, and to connect with forces greater than themselves. And while we might think we already know Egypt, the reality is that we're only scratching the surface. Tonight, as we journey through these myths, we're going to peel back layer after layer of misunderstanding. We'll see how slavery, divine kings, cursed tombs, and seductive queens were all transformed by centuries of storytelling, misinterpretation, and fantasy. We'll uncover the truth of the pyramid builders, the real roles of gods and animals, and the intellectual sophistication of the civilization that inspired awe across the ancient world and continues to captivate ours. By the end of this journey, the Egypt you thought you knew will be gone, replaced by a version that is stranger, more subtle, and infinitely more fascinating. But let's start at the beginning, the pyramids. Standing there, on the Giza Plateau, it's impossible not to feel awe. Even if you've never seen them in person, the image is seared into our collective imagination. They rise from the desert like mountains of stone, monuments to ambition, faith, and the human desire to reach beyond the mortal plane. But these stones are more than tombs. They are statements of civilization, of organization, of knowledge. Each block was quarried, shaped, and transported with precision. The construction of the pyramids reflects an understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that would not be matched for centuries. And the workers who built them, contrary to popular myth, were not nameless slaves. They were farmers in the off-season, skilled masons, artisans, and engineers, all working together to create something eternal. The Giza Plateau also shows us that Egypt was not a monolith. It was a dynamic, evolving society with cities, trade networks, and cultural exchanges. Merchants, artisans, priests, and scribes all played roles in shaping the civilization. Religion, politics, and daily life were intertwined, not just for spectacle or superstition, but as a framework for understanding the world and humanity's place within it. The pharaoh's divinity was a reflection of this cosmic order, not a license to abuse power. And here's where modern myth does the most damage. It tells us that ancient Egyptians were either primitive or fantastical, either oppressed or sinister. The truth is more fascinating. They were complex, ingenious, and deeply human. They built monuments that still astound us, wrote texts that still challenge us, and developed systems of belief that speak to universal questions about life, death, and meaning. Yet, because we've been fed centuries of misconception, we often miss the nuance, the brilliance, and the humanity behind the stone walls and painted tombs. So tonight, as we move through the next chapters, keep this in mind. Every myth we encounter, every falsehood we unravel, is an opportunity to see Egypt as it truly was. Not as a land of curses and slaves, not as a playground of seductive queens, but as a civilization of thinkers, builders, artists, and dreamers. By understanding what Egypt was really like, we can also understand something about ourselves, our fascination with the exotic, our tendency to simplify complexity, and our love for stories, no matter how inaccurate they may be. This is just the beginning. Over the next chapters, we'll explore gods who were not what we thought, queens whose legacies were distorted, and science and magic that existed hand in hand. We'll walk through tombs, temples, and deserts, uncovering truths that have been buried under myths for centuries. And by the end, you might find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about this ancient civilization. Because Egypt, in all its real, intricate, and astonishing glory, is far stranger and more beautiful than any myth could ever capture. And tonight, we're going to see it all. So, we left off with the pyramids, the iconic symbols of Egypt that everyone thinks they understand. But let's zoom in a little closer, down to the stone blocks themselves, and meet the people who actually built them. Because if you've ever imagined vast legions of enslaved labourers marching under whips, sweating endlessly under the unforgiving sun, it's time to reconsider. The story we've been told for centuries is dramatically, completely, and fundamentally wrong. Archaeological evidence from the Giza Plateau paints a very different picture. The pyramid builders were skilled labourers, artisans and farmers who participated in construction during the flood season when their fields were underwater. They weren't captives. They were workers with expertise, pride, and a sense of purpose. Excavations of workers' villages show long, well-organised streets, bakeries producing thousands of loaves of bread, breweries fermenting enormous vats of beer, and sleeping quarters that were surprisingly spacious for the era. These people were fed, housed, and cared for, not enslaved in the sense we often imagine. They had medical care. Archaeologists have found evidence of healed fractures and injuries, suggesting that their well-being mattered to the pharaohs who employed them. And there's something beautiful about the way they marked their work. In the quarries and on the stones themselves, you can still find ancient graffiti. Simple marks like, "The crew of Khufu loves their work," or "Friends of the Pyramid Crew." These weren't cries of despair, they were signatures of pride. These were people who knew they were part of something monumental, something that would last for millennia. The pyramids weren't built by oppression, They were built by collaboration, organisation, and dedication. The workers weren't slaves, they were creators of eternity. But let's not romanticise this. The work was still gruelling. Hauling massive limestone blocks, sometimes weighing over 2 tons, required skill, coordination, and stamina. Teams of workers used sledges, ropes, and ramps, combined with an astonishing understanding of leverage and weight distribution. Modern engineers still marvel at the ingenuity behind these methods, and while the labourers weren't chained, they were still part of a system demanding extreme discipline. Deadlines were real, hierarchies were strict, and mistakes could be deadly. But even within these constraints, pride and community thrived. Festivals, feasts, and communal workdays punctuated the labour, giving life to a culture that balanced effort with ritual, faith, and celebration. What's striking is that these labourers were often farmers, returning home after their seasonal work. They lived close enough to tend to their families and villages, and yet they contributed to something far beyond individual lifespans, a monument intended to echo through eternity. When we think about slave-built pyramids, we miss this subtlety, that ancient Egypt's greatest achievements were the result of organised human collaboration, ingenuity and pride, not brute force or coercion. And it wasn't just the pyramids. Temples, obelisks, tombs and statues, every massive structure required a network of labour, skill and coordination. Carvers, masons, metal workers, architects and scribes all played critical roles. Egyptians understood project management, logistics and mathematics in ways that we sometimes underestimate. The workforce was massive but structured, and every worker's contribution was recorded, acknowledged and respected. In many ways, this is why the monuments have lasted thousands of years. They were constructed not just with stone, but with thought, planning, and human ingenuity. The organisation extended beyond construction itself. Food supplies had to be planned, distributed, and rationed. Tools had to be made, maintained, and replaced. Transportation of stones required ingenuity. Ramps built from mud brick, lubricated sand to slide sledges, teams coordinating with precision timing. It's a marvel of human engineering, and yet it's often glossed over because slaves built the pyramids makes for a simpler story. We like simple stories. They're easier to visualize, easier to repeat, but they rarely capture reality. And then there's the social dimension. Evidence from workers' cemeteries shows they were buried with care, often with markers or modest grave goods. The workers weren't anonymous. They were recognized, honored, and remembered. Compare this to the image of faceless slaves, discarded and forgotten. It's almost the exact opposite of reality. The ancient Egyptians understood that those who built the eternal structures were themselves worthy of respect and remembrance. They were integral to the cosmic order that the pharaohs sought to maintain. Without these skilled hands, without their knowledge and dedication, the pyramids would not exist. History often credits kings and rulers, but in Egypt the labourers' contributions were equally monumental. So why has the myth persisted? Why do so many textbooks, films and documentaries still claim that pyramids were built by slaves? Partly it's a simplification that dates back to ancient Greek historians like Herodotus, who may have misunderstood or misrepresented Egyptian labour systems. Later, during the 19th and 20th centuries, colonial narratives emphasised suffering and oppression to create dramatic stories for European audiences. And of course, movies and media love the drama of struggle, cruelty, and rebellion. It's easier to tell a story of oppression than a story of prideful, organised labour building monumental tombs in the desert. But the truth is far more compelling. Imagine thousands of people, seasonally unemployed farmers, coming together under a shared purpose. Skilled artisans carving limestone and granite with precision. Engineers designing ramps and transportation systems that could move 2-ton blocks. Workers collaborating with pride, leaving messages in the stones they hauled, knowing that their labour would echo for millennia. That's Egypt. That's the civilization behind the myths, and it's far more inspiring than any story of slavery and oppression. Now, it's also important to acknowledge that Egypt was not a utopia. Hierarchies existed, and life could be brutal. But the pyramid builders weren't captives. They weren't expendable. They were respected, valued, and integral to the society that created some of humanity's most enduring monuments. They were people who understood that their work mattered, that they were part of something far larger than themselves, a civilization striving to reach the eternal through stone, faith, and skill. And there's an elegance in that. The pyramids aren't just tombs, they're statements about human potential, organization, and ambition. They're evidence that when people collaborate, plan, and combine knowledge with effort, they can achieve feats that seem impossible. And perhaps that's one of the reasons the myth of slaves persists. It simplifies a miracle into something cruel and digestible, removing the beauty of human achievement from the narrative. Because at the heart of Egypt, at the heart of the pyramids, is a story of people. Ordinary, extraordinary, skilled, human. Men and women whose work, dedication and knowledge built structures meant to last forever. Structures that still inspire awe thousands of years later. That's the truth behind the myth. The pyramids weren't built by oppression. They were built by excellence, collaboration, and a desire to reach beyond mortality. And as we continue this journey through ancient Egypt, remember this. Every myth we've been told about slaves, curses, and kings exists because reality is too amazing to be simple. The more we dig, the more we uncover the sophistication, ingenuity, and humanity of a civilization that continues to astonish us. By looking past the myths, we can see the people, their lives, their ambitions, and their brilliance. And that, my friends, is where the real story begins. Next, we'll explore the pharaohs themselves, not just as rulers, but as symbols, as leaders, and as humans who walked the same sand and felt the same sun as the workers who built their monuments. Because understanding the builders of eternity also requires understanding the society they served, and the delicate balance between human ambition and divine order that defined Egypt for thousands of years. The pyramids are only the beginning, and as we move forward, the myths will continue to unravel, revealing a civilization more complex, more brilliant, and far stranger than you ever imagined. So far, we've met the people who actually built the pyramids, the men and women whose labour and skill turned stone into eternity. But if the builders were the hands, then the pharaohs were the vision. And it's here, in the interplay between king and worker, that much of Egypt's misunderstood mystique begins. We've all grown up with images of pharaohs as omnipotent rulers, larger-than-life figures sitting on golden thrones commanding armies and wielding supernatural authority. They were supposedly untouchable, feared by their people, and worshipped as literal gods walking the earth. But the reality, it's far more subtle, fascinating, and human. Let's start with the concept of divinity. Pharaohs were called gods, yes, but not in the way we might think. They were divine in function, not in biology. Their divinity was about maintaining Ma'at, the principle of balance, truth, and cosmic order that governed not just society, but the universe itself. To the Egyptians, chaos wasn't a metaphor. It was a real force, threatening the Nile, the land, and life itself. Pharaohs were guardians against chaos, living embodiments of the harmony that kept everything in equilibrium. Their power wasn't arbitrary, it was symbolic, spiritual, and deeply connected to the cosmos. They were gods in office, so to speak, not in literal flesh and blood divinity. This perspective changes everything we thought about Egyptian leadership. Pharaohs weren't tyrants in the modern sense. They were part of a system that balanced politics, religion, and society. They acted as intermediaries between gods and humans, mediators of cosmic order. They were expected to lead, yes, but their authority came with enormous responsibility. A pharaoh who failed to maintain Ma'at wasn't just politically weak, they were spiritually dangerous. Famine, floods, and chaos were interpreted as signs that the king had faltered. Leadership was both ceremonial and practical, a careful dance between ritual, administration, and public perception. And here's where myths start to distort reality. We've been told that pharaohs wielded absolute power over every aspect of life, yet evidence shows a more nuanced system. Egypt had administrators, scribes, and local officials managing day-to-day governance. Pharaohs made the big decisions, yes, but they relied on a sophisticated bureaucracy to keep the country running. Taxes, agriculture, trade, and law weren't dictated solely from the throne. They were coordinated by professionals whose work was essential to the stability of the kingdom. Pharaohs were leaders, but leadership was collaborative in its essence, structured and organised, not purely authoritarian. The iconography surrounding pharaohs also played a key role in the myths. Crowns, staffs, and ceremonial attire were more than decoration. They were symbols of legitimacy, power, and cosmic alignment. Each item, from the double crown representing Upper and Lower Egypt to the crook and flail, told a story about the ruler's role as protector and nurturer. The larger-than-life imagery, which seems theatrical to modern eyes, was functional in ancient society. It communicated authority, spiritual significance, and the pharaoh's role in maintaining universal balance. Misunderstood by modern audiences, it has been reduced to spectacle, contributing to the notion of pharaohs as tyrannical or godlike in the literal sense. Then there's the personal life of the pharaohs, a topic wrapped in centuries of rumour, misinterpretation, and fascination. We tend to imagine indulgence, opulence, and decadence. Certainly some pharaohs enjoyed luxuries, but the reality is often more grounded. Their lives were highly regulated, with social expectations, ritual obligations, and immense public scrutiny. A pharaoh's actions weren't private. They were public statements, examples of order, morality, and cosmic responsibility. Every decision, every marriage, every public appearance contributed to the perception of Ma'at and the maintenance of social and spiritual harmony. In other words, the personal life of a pharaoh was political, spiritual, and profoundly symbolic. And this is where modern misconceptions about tyranny and oppression emerge. We see pyramids, golden tombs, and elaborate rituals, and we assume cruelty, extravagance, and abuse. But these are symbols, not proof of despotism. Pharaohs lived in a world where image, ritual, and symbolic action mattered as much as practical governance. They weren't omnipotent overlords. They were carefully performing roles within a civilization that valued order, tradition, and cosmic harmony above all else. Take, for example, Ramesses II, often called Ramesses the Great. He is remembered as a conqueror, a monumental builder, and a king whose statues dominate the modern imagination. But beyond the propaganda, Ramesses was a master of image-making. His monuments, inscriptions, and public works were less about vanity and more about communicating legitimacy, power, and stability to a complex society. The king's life was a performance in service of order, designed to inspire awe, respect, and obedience, not to create terror. Modern interpretations often ignore the strategic, symbolic, and communicative aspects of pharaonic life, turning complexity into caricature. Even death, the ultimate Egyptian obsession, reinforces the pharaoh's misunderstood image. Tombs, mummies, and funerary practices are often portrayed as macabre rituals or proof of obsession with immortality in a grotesque sense. In reality, burial practices reflected a profound understanding of mortality, memory, and the spiritual journey. Pharaohs were buried with items meant to preserve life, honour the dead, and maintain their influence in the afterlife. These practices weren't exotic, scary, or irrational. They were deeply philosophical, connected to belief systems that integrated ethics, spirituality, and cosmic order. The modern fascination with curses and mummies rising from the dead obscures this depth, turning reverence into sensationalism. The divine illusion also extended to Pharaoh's relationships with the gods themselves. Temples, rituals, and prayers were designed to align human action with divine will. Pharaohs didn't rule because they were gods. They ruled to embody and enact divine principles. Their actions were sacred, public, and symbolic, not necessarily supernatural. Misunderstandings of this relationship have led to centuries of misinterpretation, giving rise to images of godlike kings who could command reality itself. In truth, they could command people, resources, and rituals, but their divinity was performance, responsibility, and alignment with cosmic order, not omnipotence. So, when we imagine pharaohs as tyrants, gods, or mystical overlords, we're missing the point. They were complex, symbolic, and human. Their power was real, but structured. Their divinity was functional, not literal. Their lives were both political and ritualized. They were the anchors of a civilization that thrived for thousands of years, balancing spiritual, social, and administrative forces with remarkable sophistication. Pharaohs were both extraordinary and human, embodiments of a civilization's ideals, rather than caricatures of tyranny or magic. Understanding this is crucial, because it sets the stage for everything else we think we know about Egypt. The myths about slaves, curses, and seductive queens all intersect with misunderstandings about power. Once we see pharaohs as humans performing roles within a complex system, we start to understand the broader society, its laws, beliefs, labour systems, and social dynamics. The divine illusion is a lens, a performance, and a symbol, not a literal description of reality. By separating image from truth, we get closer to the astonishing reality of Egypt. As we continue, we'll meet the gods themselves, not monsters or caricatures, but sophisticated embodiments of natural and cosmic principles. We'll see how religious belief, political authority, and human creativity intertwined in ways that modern interpretations often fail to capture. And we'll begin to understand that the myths we've inherited about pharaohs, whether of cruelty, magic, or divinity, are only the surface of a far deeper, far more fascinating story. Because in Egypt, even the kings were human, and understanding their humanity is key to understanding the civilization itself. The pharaohs were the visionaries, the symbols, and the anchors of Mayat, but they could not exist without the hands, hearts, and minds of the people we met in Chapter 2, the workers, artisans, and farmers who built eternity. Together, vision and labour, symbol and reality, myth and truth, created the civilization that continues to captivate us today. And now, as we move forward, we'll take the next step into Egypt's spiritual world. We'll explore the gods, the myths, and the sacred forces that guided every action, decision, and life in this remarkable civilization. We'll discover how the divine illusion shaped society, inspired art, and structured daily life, and how centuries of misinterpretation have turned these profound beliefs into caricatures and myths that persist even today. Because understanding the pharaohs is only the beginning. To understand Egypt, we must understand the divine framework that held everything together, and the myths that grew from it. So far, we've explored the people who built the pyramids and the pharaohs who embodied the vision of ancient Egypt. But no discussion of Egypt is complete without its gods, and when people think of Egyptian gods, the first name that comes to mind is almost always Ra, the sun god, the eternal light, the ruler of the skies. But here's the thing, the way we think about Ra, and Egyptian gods in general, is completely wrong. We picture them as literal beings, supernatural entities with glowing crowns, terrifying powers, or magical intervention in daily life. That's not how the Egyptians themselves understood them. To truly grasp Ra, we need to peel back the layers of mythology, misinterpretation, and modern imagination. Ra was not the sun. in the simple sense we might imagine. He wasn't a literal celestial ball in human form riding across the sky in a golden chariot. He was a symbol, a representation of cosmic order, life, and the daily renewal of the world. The Egyptians observed the sun's cycles, its rising, its zenith, its setting, and they understood them as a rhythm of life and death, of renewal and decay. Ra was the embodiment of that cycle, the force that ensured the world continued in balance. Worshipping Ra wasn't about praying to a fiery god in the sky. It was about recognizing the fundamental structure of existence and the rhythms that governed it. Every day, the sun rose, traversed the sky, and set, and with it, Ra renewed life, brought order, and banished chaos. That was the essence of his divinity. Now, here's where misconceptions start to creep in. Modern interpretations, fueled by art, literature, and film, often depict Ra as a solitary, tyrannical god, glowing in isolation while mortals bow in fear. That's dramatic, yes, but it's inaccurate. Ra was part of a complex pantheon, interacting with other deities like Osiris, Isis, Hathor, and Thoth. Each god represented aspects of the world, human experience or cosmic principles, and Ra was the unifying light, the force that sustained all life and held the balance. He wasn't omnipotent in isolation. His power was relational, functional, and deeply symbolic. Understanding Ra requires understanding context. Egyptian religion was about relationships between forces, not one supreme being dictating reality. The imagery surrounding Ra also shaped misconceptions. Artists often portrayed him with a falcon head and a solar disk, flying across the sky or riding the celestial bark. To modernize, these images seem literal, depictions of a bird-headed deity cruising the heavens. But for Egyptians, these were symbolic tools. The falcon represented keen sight, dominion over the sky, and divine vision. The solar disk represented life, continuity, and the cyclical nature of existence. In other words, the images were metaphors, not literal depictions, and yet we've interpreted them literally for centuries, creating the illusion of a god who physically existed in ways that humans could see and interact with daily. Ra's journey through the day and the night also reveals much about Egyptian cosmology. By day, he travels across the sky, giving light, warmth, and energy to the world. By night, he journeys through the underworld, confronting chaos, serpents, and forces of disorder. Each night is a battle, but also a renewal. By morning he rises again, completing the eternal cycle. The Egyptians didn't think of this as a superhero story. They thought of it as a framework for understanding life itself. The rise and fall of the sun mirrored human existence, agriculture, morality, and society. Ra was a guide, a principle, and a reminder of the balance that underpins reality. And here's a nuance that modern myths completely overlook. Ra was not universally worshipped in the same way everywhere or at every time. Egypt was vast, with cities, regions, and dynasties developing their own theological interpretations. In some periods, Ra merged with other deities, like Amun, forming Amun-Ra, a more complex cosmic figure. In other eras, he was associated with local cults, agricultural rituals, or temple ceremonies. The Egyptians didn't have a single rigid religion. They had a fluid, evolving spiritual system that responded to time, politics, and culture. And yet, Western interpretations often flatten this complexity, portraying Ra as a singular, immutable, almost cartoonish figure of power. And that's the pattern, really, when it comes to Egyptian religion. We simplify, we reduce, we translate thousands of years of theology, ritual, and philosophy into easily digestible images, glowing gods, dramatic curses, magical spells. But the truth is far more sophisticated. The gods were not whimsical characters or monsters. They were conceptual frameworks, models of the universe, guides for human behaviour, and representations of forces that ancient Egyptians observed and respected. To worship Ra wasn't to pray to a literal sun god. It was to align oneself with the cycles of life, the rhythms of the universe, and the eternal principles of order and balance. Consider the temples dedicated to Ra. These were not just places of religious ceremony, they were astronomical observatories, centres of learning and hubs of civic life. Priests didn't perform magic tricks, they recorded celestial events, calculated calendars, managed resources, and interpreted the cosmos. Religious practice was deeply integrated into daily life, politics, and governance. Ra's temples were as much about practical administration as they were about spiritual reverence. And yet, popular culture prefers to focus on the sensational, the god in the sky, the ritual of fire and incense, the dramatic encounters with the divine, obscuring the reality of a sophisticated, practical, and deeply symbolic religious system. So why do we persist in seeing Ra and other Egyptian gods as fantastical, almost caricatured figures? Partly because symbols are harder to convey than spectacle. A literal god is easy to depict, easy to imagine, and easy to dramatize. A conceptual principle embodied in daily rituals, agriculture, law, and moral behavior. That's harder to translate into a film, a painting, or a meme. And yet, that is the reality. Ra was everywhere and nowhere, guiding, sustaining, and symbolizing life itself, without ever needing to perform miracles in the way modern myths imagine. Understanding Ra reshapes how we see all Egyptian gods. They were not objects of fear, not whimsical supernatural beings, and not moral arbiters in the way Western traditions often portray deities. They were models of the universe, representing the interplay of natural forces, human morality, and cosmic balance. They were guides for living, understanding, and surviving in a complex world. And most importantly, they were interconnected. The divine was relational, embedded in the rhythms of nature and society, not a collection of isolated figures performing acts of magic or judgment. This perspective also helps explain why ancient Egyptian art is so symbolic, so precise, and so enduring. The gods, the symbols, the rituals, they were all designed to communicate meaning, to align human life with cosmic principles, and to remind society of the delicate balance of existence. And in modern times, we've misunderstood these symbols, simplifying them into caricatures that capture attention but miss substance. Ra is the perfect example. Not a solitary sun god, not a fantastical character, but a principle, a framework, a cosmic guide. As we move forward, keep this in mind. Egypt's power, sophistication, and enduring fascination don't come from literal magic or monstrous gods. They come from the elegance of thought, observation, and symbolism. Ra, in all his conceptual glory, teaches us that understanding a civilization requires looking past spectacle and myth, and appreciating complexity, nuance, and meaning. Next, we'll explore another facet of Egyptian myth, the gods most often misunderstood in modern culture, Bastet, Anubis, and others whose popular images have been warped by centuries of misinterpretation. We'll see how animals, protection, and spiritual guidance were central to everyday life, and how these symbols became distorted over time. Because if Ra shows us the cosmic order, these gods show us the personal, the protective, and the intimate sides of Egyptian belief, and why so many of us still get them wrong today. When we think about ancient Egypt, most people imagine a civilization frozen in time, monumental pyramids, inscrutable pharaohs, and an unchanging landscape of sand and Nile. But that's a gross oversimplification. Ancient Egypt wasn't a static world. It was dynamic, evolving, and often misunderstood by those who came later. Every period brought innovation, adaptation, and transformation. Yet somehow, much of this sophistication has been lost in translation, filtered through the lens of foreign writers, explorers, and eventually popular culture. What survives in the popular imagination is a snapshot, not a story, and that's exactly the problem. Let's begin with the origins. Civilization along the Nile didn't appear overnight. It emerged from millennia of human adaptation, trial and observation. Communities learned to harness the annual flooding of the Nile, developing agriculture that could support large populations. They built canals, dams and irrigation systems long before the pyramids rose, and they developed social structures that balanced cooperation with hierarchy. Early settlements like Hierakonpolis, Abydos and Nakada laid the groundwork for what would become the Old Kingdom, the era that gave birth to the pyramids and monumental stone architecture. These were communities experimenting with governance, ritual and engineering, learning from generations of trial and error. Yet, when European explorers encountered Egypt in the 18th and 19th centuries, they often described it as exotic, timeless and primitive. They were fascinated by the monuments but failed to recognize the layers of human history that produced them. Egypt was portrayed as a land of mystery rather than a society of ingenuity. This view persists today. People imagine that the pharaohs and their subjects lived in a frozen tableau, rather than a complex evolving civilization responding to challenges, innovations and opportunities. By simplifying Egypt into spectacle, we lose the reality of its cultural, technological and intellectual growth. Take writing, for example. Hieroglyphics weren't merely decorative. They were a sophisticated system for recording law, religion, trade, and daily life. Scribes held enormous power and responsibility, and literacy was highly specialized. Writing allowed for administration over vast distances and time, enabled detailed astronomical observations, and preserved religious and cultural narratives for millennia. And yet, modern depictions often reduce hieroglyphs to mysterious symbols or magical writing, missing the depth of intellectual achievement behind them. Art is another area where misunderstanding dominates. Egyptian art is often labelled as rigid, repetitive, or formulaic. But these conventions were deliberate, not primitive. Proportions, poses, and perspectives followed strict symbolic rules to convey meaning, status, and function. A seated figure isn't badly drawn. It's communicating hierarchy, importance, and role. Colours were chosen not randomly but for symbolic resonance. Green for life and fertility, red for chaos and energy, gold for divine essence. Modern audiences interpret these artistic conventions through the lens of personal taste, mistaking symbolism for simplicity. In reality, the precision and consistency of Egyptian art is a testament to an advanced, coherent visual language designed to endure across centuries. Religion, too, is often misunderstood. We tend to focus on the exotic or terrifying, curses, mummies, and animal-headed gods. But Egyptian religion was practical, integrative, and deeply connected to daily life. Temples were centres of administration, education, and social coordination, not just places for ritual spectacle. Priests managed grain supplies, recorded taxes, and observed celestial cycles. Their spiritual duties were inseparable from their societal roles. By reducing religion to myth or magic, modern narratives erase the organisational genius and philosophical depth that underpinned Egyptian society. Political systems also demonstrate this sophistication. Pharaohs relied on complex bureaucracies to govern an empire that stretched hundreds of miles along the Nile. Local governors, tax collectors, and judicial officials managed day-to-day life, ensuring stability and resource distribution. Laws weren't arbitrary. They were codified, enforced, and linked to the principles of Mayat. The pharaoh's role was to oversee and embody this order, not to micromanage every village. Simplifying this into images of tyrannical kings or mystical overlords obscures the reality. Ancient Egypt functioned because of careful administration, social cooperation, and the integration of religious, legal, and civic principles. Trade and diplomacy reveal further layers. Egyptians maintained long-distance trade networks with Nubia, the Levant, and even Crete. They imported timber, metals, and luxury goods, while exporting grain, papyrus, and stone. Trade wasn't random. It was managed, negotiated, and strategically aligned with political goals. Yet in popular imagination, Egypt is often depicted as isolated, inward-looking, or entirely defined by monumental architecture. The truth is a civilization in motion, interacting with neighbours, adapting to environmental and political pressures, and thriving through strategic foresight. Even technology is routinely underestimated. Simple descriptions of pyramids as stones stacked together completely miss the innovation involved. Egyptians developed advanced surveying techniques, precise measurements, and tools capable of cutting and moving massive blocks. They understood geometry, leverage, and material properties. They experimented with construction techniques over generations, refining methods through trial, error, and observation. Modern narratives prefer the sensational, slaves, curses, and divine intervention, rather than recognizing the brilliance of applied knowledge that made Egypt's monuments possible. Perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of early Egyptian civilization is the human element. Ancient Egyptians were not faceless workers, nameless priests, or robotic builders. They were people with ambitions, families, fears, and creativity. They celebrated festivals, painted murals, wrote letters, debated philosophy, and recorded their histories. Modern myths often erase this humanity, turning the past into a spectacle of terror, awe, or caricature. Yet the real Egypt was lived by real people, innovators, dreamers, and problem solvers, navigating one of the most challenging and inspiring environments on Earth. And that's why Egypt continues to fascinate. It's not the curses, the treasure, or the sensationalized stories that endure. It's the human achievement, the sophistication, and the layered complexity that survive millennia. Every monument, every temple, every tomb is a record of problem-solving, creativity, and cultural evolution. By focusing on myths and oversimplifications, we miss the narrative of a civilization that mastered environment, governance, and knowledge to create something lasting, beautiful, and astonishingly advanced. So, when we say that Egypt is misunderstood, we mean more than a few false stories about slaves or gods. We mean that the very essence of this civilization, its people, their intellect, its innovation, and its adaptability, is often obscured by centuries of simplification, sensationalism, and misinterpretation. To truly understand Egypt, we must peel back these myths, examine the evidence, and see the civilization as it really was, alive, dynamic, and endlessly ingenious. When most people think of Egyptian gods, the first images that come to mind are animals. Cats, crocodiles, cobras, falcons, sometimes human bodies with animal heads. And naturally, modern imagination runs wild. Cats as divine creatures, crocodiles as monstrous deities, cobras as eternal protectors, or threats. But here's the truth. The Egyptians didn't worship animals for their cuteness, ferocity, or visual drama. Animals were symbols, tools for understanding the world, and metaphors for power, protection, and balance. And yet, over centuries, these symbolic meanings have been wildly distorted. Let's start with the cat, the most famous of Egyptian sacred animals. People today assume Egyptians worshipped cats as literal deities, pampering them and attributing supernatural powers. In reality, cats were revered because they were protectors of life and property. A single cat could control rats, snakes, and other threats to grain and food stores, safeguarding both sustenance and civilization itself. Bastet, the cat-headed goddess, embodies this principle. She wasn't just a cute cat goddess, she represented protection, home, fertility, and the careful balance of domestic life. To revere Bastet was to honour vigilance, care, and the safety of one's household. It was practical, symbolic, and deeply tied to human survival, not merely aesthetic or whimsical. Next, the cobra. Often depicted on crowns, temple walls, and royal insignia, the cobra was associated with Wadjet, the protective goddess of Lower Egypt. Modern portrayals exaggerate the danger and mystique. An image of hooded snakes striking fear into the hearts of pharaohs and enemies alike. But Wadjet symbolized protection, vigilance, and divine guardianship. The cobra's presence on the pharaoh's crown communicated a very practical message. The king is protected, the land is defended, and danger is kept at bay. It's not magic, it's metaphor, a visual language communicating security and power. Then we have crocodiles. Sobek, the crocodile god, often terrifies modern audiences. People see him as a monstrous, violent deity demanding human sacrifice. The truth is far more nuanced. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, was also a source of danger. Crocodiles were predators, yes, but they were also part of the ecosystem that supported life. Sobek embodies the dual nature of the river, life-giver and threat. Worshipping Sobek wasn't about fear, it was about understanding, respecting, and aligning with the forces that sustained civilization. He was a symbol of strength, vigilance, and adaptability. In essence, Sobek teaches that danger, when understood and respected, becomes part of the balance of life. What's fascinating is how these animal symbols permeated everyday life. Egyptians didn't just worship these animals abstractly, they integrated them into rituals, art, and social practice. Statues of Bastet stood in homes as protective icons. Cobra imagery appeared in temples, tombs, and ceremonial attire to symbolize divine guardianship. Sobek's presence in temples near the Nile reflected ecological and spiritual understanding, reminding people that survival depended on harmony with natural forces. Animals were language, philosophy, and guideposts, not mere idols to be adored blindly. And yet, Western interpretations have completely misunderstood this. The idea of animal-headed gods, for instance, is often portrayed as weird, exotic, or magical in a superficial sense. Movies show people bowing to lions, cats, or crocodiles, sometimes even dramatizing violence or ritual sacrifice. Archaeology, inscriptions, and temple art tell a different story. These figures were symbolic, didactic, and deeply integrated with everyday life. The animals represented qualities humans needed to understand, respect, and emulate: strength, vigilance, protection, fertility, and cosmic balance. Even more intriguing is the relational aspect of these gods. Bastet didn't exist in isolation. She interacted with other deities in mythology, just as cats existed in homes, granaries, and communities. Sobek's presence was balanced by Ra, Isis, and other gods representing order, fertility, and cosmic rhythm. Animals, gods, and humans formed a network of relationships that maintained societal and cosmic equilibrium. Modern storytelling often isolates them for dramatic effect, turning integrated symbols into disconnected curiosities. This also highlights another point. The Egyptians didn't fear the gods in the modern sense. Reverence didn't mean terror. It meant understanding, alignment, and respect. The symbolism of cats, cobras, and crocodiles taught humans how to live in harmony with the world, not how to appease capricious supernatural beings. Misinterpretations, fueled by sensationalist media, have turned practical, philosophical, and symbolic relationships into myths of fear, superstition, and exoticism. So, next time you see a cat statue, a carved cobra, or a depiction of a crocodile god, remember, these weren't objects of magical worship. They were tools for understanding life, for teaching lessons about vigilance, protection, and balance. They were reminders that humans are part of a larger ecosystem, and survival depends on awareness, respect, and integration with forces both visible and invisible. The animals were the language of the Egyptians, a symbolic vocabulary that communicated principles, ethics, and strategies for thriving in a challenging world. And the best part? These symbols weren't static, they evolved. Bastet's form changed over centuries, reflecting shifting social, political, and religious contexts. Cobras shifted from local protective spirits to symbols of royal authority. Sobek's worship grew and adapted as understanding of the Nile, agriculture, and human settlement changed. Egypt wasn't a frozen tableau of belief. It was a living, evolving civilization, using symbolism to make sense of their world. In essence, cats, cobras, and crocodiles teach us something crucial, that what looks strange or magical to modern eyes often has a rational, symbolic, and deeply human explanation. Understanding these symbols brings us closer to the Egyptians themselves, revealing a civilization that observed, analysed, and encoded wisdom into every aspect of life, from the mundane to the cosmic. And the myths that persist today, whether about cute cat gods or terrifying crocodiles, obscure that brilliance. Next, we'll explore another layer of Egyptian society, the misunderstood queens, the real women of power, and how their legacies were warped by myth and foreign interpretation. We'll see how figures like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra were portrayed in ways that distort their intelligence, political acumen, and authority, and how modern storytelling has turned them into mere caricatures of seduction or drama. Because if cats, cobras, and crocodiles show a symbolic wisdom, the queens reveal the human, political, and strategic genius of ancient Egypt. When we think of ancient Egypt, most of us imagine the pharaohs as the sole stars of the story, while queens are reduced to silent companions, seductive distractions, or tragic figures. Cleopatra, Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, names we all recognise but whose realities are almost entirely obscured by myth. Modern narratives often frame these women as either manipulative seductresses or passive ornaments to the power of men. The truth, however, is far more compelling. Egyptian queens were political masterminds, strategic leaders, and powerful figures who shaped the course of history. And yet, their legacies have been distorted by centuries of foreign interpretation and imagination. Let's start with Hatshepsut, one of the most famous and misunderstood queens of Egypt. Hatshepsut wasn't just a ruler. She was a pharaoh in her own right, who governed for over 2 decades during the 18th dynasty. She assumed the throne after her husband's death, initially as regent for her stepson, but quickly consolidated power in her own name. To maintain authority, she adopted some traditional male pharaonic imagery, false beards, masculine pronouns, and ceremonial regalia. But these were political strategies, not indicators of identity confusion. She understood the importance of perception in governance. Hatshepsut ruled effectively, commissioning monumental architecture, organising trade expeditions to Punt, and stabilising the nation economically and politically. Her reign demonstrates a keen strategic mind, an understanding of diplomacy, and an ability to navigate societal expectations, all qualities ignored in popular narratives. Nefertiti, another iconic queen, is similarly misunderstood. Often depicted in modern media as a beauty whose power came solely from her appearance, Nefertiti was in fact a key political and religious figure. She played a central role in the Amarna Revolution, alongside Akhenaten, helping to implement radical changes in religious practice and governance. The famous bust of Nefertiti captures more than aesthetic beauty. It symbolises authority, elegance, and intelligence. She was actively shaping religious policy, diplomacy, and culture. To reduce her legacy to mere allure is to erase her intellect, her strategy, and her profound influence on Egyptian history. And then there's Cleopatra, the queen most famous in Western imagination. Modern culture emphasises her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, framing her as a seductress whose political power derived from personal manipulation. But Cleopatra was far more than that. She was a multilingual, educated, and politically astute ruler, fluent in at least 9 languages, managing a complex kingdom facing Roman encroachment. Her strategies combined diplomacy, military planning, and economic acumen. Cleopatra's alliances were calculated moves to preserve Egypt's independence and prosperity, not mere romantic escapades. Yet centuries of Roman propaganda, Shakespearean dramatization, and Hollywood storytelling have reduced her brilliance to a simplified tale of romance, sex, and scandal. What's striking is how these distortions reveal modern biases. Women in power are often either demonized or sexualized, and Egypt's queens have not been spared. Where male rulers are celebrated for strategy, conquest, and statecraft, female rulers are recast as manipulative, seductive, or tragic. This oversimplification obscures the reality. Egyptian queens wielded authority legally, strategically, and effectively. Their power was codified, their influence visible in administration, diplomacy, and monumental building projects. They were integral to governance, not peripheral accessories to male rulers. Egyptian queens also provide insight into the social structure of the time. Marriage wasn't merely personal, it was political, symbolic, and strategic. Alliances between families, dynasties, and regions were secured through carefully arranged unions. Queens often served as intermediaries, negotiators, and cultural diplomats, mediating between local elites, religious institutions, and the pharaoh himself. Their roles were not ceremonial, they were central to the functioning of the state. Misrepresenting queens as ornamental or purely romantic figures misses their critical function in maintaining political stability and continuity. Even funerary practices highlight the distinction between myth and reality. Tombs of queens, such as Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari, reflect political propaganda, religious authority, and sophisticated architectural knowledge. These structures weren't merely luxurious or aesthetic, they were statements of legitimacy, power, and continuity. By analysing them, historians can trace the strategies queens used to assert authority, communicate divine alignment, and consolidate political influence. Popular interpretations, however, focus on beauty, intrigue, and mystery, ignoring the deeply strategic aspects of these legacies. The distortion of queens' legacies also extends to popular culture. Movies, novels, and media often flatten historical figures into archetypes. The beautiful seductress, the tragic ruler, the mystical enigma. These images captivate audiences but erase complexity, turning brilliant women into one-dimensional characters. In truth, queens like Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra were navigating power in challenging political landscapes, balancing diplomacy, religion, military threats, and public perception. Their achievements were extraordinary, and yet our understanding is filtered through myths that emphasize appearance or scandal over substance. This misrepresentation has consequences beyond history. It shapes our perception of leadership, gender, and intelligence across cultures. By ignoring the political and intellectual achievements of Egypt's queens, we perpetuate the notion that women in power are inherently exceptional, dependent on charm or circumstance rather than skill, strategy, and intellect. The reality of Egyptian queens challenges this narrative. They were deliberate, capable, and effective leaders whose authority shaped one of history's most enduring civilizations. In understanding queens, we also see how mythology intertwines with reality. Many queens were associated with goddesses, divine principles, or symbolic imagery. Hathor, Isis, and Sekhmet were more than myths. They were frameworks for understanding leadership, protection, fertility, and cosmic order. Queens drew on these symbols to reinforce authority, legitimacy, and alignment with Ma'at. Far from being passive figures, they strategically integrated mythology into governance, using religious and cultural symbolism to consolidate power, influence public perception, and communicate strategic intent. The takeaway: Egyptian queens were not ornaments, seductresses, or passive players. They were leaders, strategists, diplomats, and symbols of continuity. Their misrepresentation in modern culture, through bias, sensationalism, or simplification, has created a false narrative, overshadowing the brilliance, intelligence, and influence they wielded. By looking beyond the myths, we can appreciate the full scope of their power and the sophistication of the civilization they helped sustain. Next, we'll dive into the myths surrounding death, mummies, and the afterlife, another area where popular perception diverges sharply from reality. We'll uncover how tombs, funerary practices, and spiritual beliefs were misrepresented as exotic or macabre, when in fact they reflect profound philosophical, societal, and religious sophistication. Because after understanding the queens, the next layer of Egypt's misunderstood genius is how they approached life, death, and eternity itself. When it comes to ancient Egypt, nothing captures the modern imagination like mummies, tombs, and the afterlife. Movies, books, and documentaries have trained us to see Egyptian death rituals as morbid, mystical, or even downright terrifying. Curse-laden sarcophagi, undead kings, and supernatural horrors populate popular culture. But the truth? Ancient Egyptians approached death not with fear or superstition, but with profound philosophy, meticulous planning, and spiritual sophistication. Their practices were about continuity, balance, and understanding the eternal, not horror. Let's start with mummification. Modern audiences assume it's a bizarre, grotesque practice performed by mystical priests. In reality, mummification was a highly sophisticated preservation technique developed over centuries. It wasn't about creating undead beings. It was about protecting the body so the soul could transition into the afterlife. Egyptians believed in multiple aspects of the self: the physical body, Ket, the soul, Ba, and the vital essence, Ka. Proper preservation of the body was essential because it housed these spiritual components. Without it, the soul could not function in the eternal realm. The methods, removing organs, dehydrating the body, embalming with oils and resins, were practical, informed by observation, chemistry, and anatomy. This was science meeting spirituality, not superstition. Tombs, too, were far more than decorative or ceremonial. They were carefully designed structures that served both practical and symbolic purposes. Chambers, passages, and orientation reflected beliefs about the journey into the afterlife. Walls adorned with hieroglyphics, paintings, and reliefs were not mere decoration. They were guides for the deceased, instructions for navigating the spiritual realm, and expressions of moral and cosmic order. Scenes depicting offerings, daily activities, and protective rituals were teaching tools, ensuring continuity of life beyond death. Modern depictions of tombs as haunted or forbidden ignore the careful logic and deep symbolism behind every stone and painting. And then there's the concept of the afterlife itself. Popular imagination often assumes it was an exotic paradise, a land of treasure and luxury, or conversely a place of terrifying trials. In truth, the afterlife was an extension of earthly existence, governed by Ma'at and structured by moral and ritual practices. The deceased were judged not by fear of punishment, but by alignment with cosmic and ethical order. The weighing of the heart ceremony, for example, wasn't a terrifying ordeal designed for drama. It symbolized moral balance and truth. The heart represented conscience and integrity, and a life lived in harmony with Ma'at ensured continuity in the eternal realm. Death was a transition, not a spectacle. The objects buried with the deceased were similarly misunderstood. Modern interpretations often reduce them to treasures or evidence of extravagance. In reality, these items had functional and symbolic purposes. Food, clothing, tools, and models of servants or animals were intended to provide comfort, sustenance, and utility in the afterlife. Jewellery, amulets, and symbols protected, guided, and connected the deceased to divine forces. Every item was deliberate, a reflection of cultural values and spiritual understanding. Far from being mere indulgence, funerary goods were practical, symbolic, and deeply meaningful. Even the notion of curses has been distorted. Popular media depicts tombs as traps for the unwary, invoking supernatural vengeance on anyone who disturbs the dead. Archaeological and textual evidence tells a different story. Curses were often warnings or ritual inscriptions designed to protect tombs from theft or desecration, not mystical forces targeting humans. They reflect social and legal mechanisms, invoking spiritual authority to safeguard property and respect, not a desire to terrify the living. The myth of deadly curses has little basis in reality and serves more as entertainment than historical fact. Another layer often ignored is the role of the living in these practices. Funerary rites were community events, integrating family, priests, artisans, and the state. Preparing a tomb or organising a mummification ceremony wasn't just a private affair, it involved social coordination, economic resources, and religious expertise. Death rituals reinforced social bonds, communicated family status, and maintained continuity with the divine and the cosmos. Modern portrayals of isolated mummies or secretive tombs miss this communal and societal dimension entirely. And then there's time. Egyptians conceived of eternity in ways that differ radically from modern linear perception. Life, death, and the afterlife were cycles, deeply intertwined with celestial movements, seasonal changes, and cosmic rhythms. Funerary texts, like the pyramid texts or the Book of the Dead, provide intricate guides for navigating these cycles. They weren't fanciful stories. They were philosophical and practical manuals, encoding knowledge about morality, cosmology, and survival beyond mortal existence. Misinterpreting these texts as spells or magic diminishes their intellectual and spiritual significance. Even kings and queens approach death with this perspective. The pyramids, tombs, and mortuary temples weren't simply architectural marvels. They were embodiments of cosmic principles, societal order, and spiritual continuity. Pharaohs weren't obsessed with personal immortality in a superficial sense. They were maintaining the eternal structure of Egypt, ensuring mayat, and connecting society with the divine. Death rituals, monuments, and funerary practices were all tools in this larger philosophical and societal endeavour. So, when we think about mummies, tombs, or the afterlife, it's time to move past the horror and spectacle. Ancient Egyptians approached death with intellect, purpose, and a deep understanding of existence. Their practices reflected philosophy, science, and spiritual sophistication. Modern myths, curses, undead kings, or macabre obsessions have distorted a worldview that is far richer, more logical, and more profound than entertainment ever portrays. In the next chapter, we'll explore another layer of misunderstanding: Egyptian magic, spells, and rituals. Popular culture treats magic as supernatural trickery or horror, but in reality, it was a rational, structured system for influencing environment, health, and social order. By looking at these practices through the lens of knowledge and symbolism, we can finally see how much of what we believe about Egyptian magic is completely wrong, and yet incredibly brilliant. When most people hear the word magic in relation to ancient Egypt, images of spell books, curses, enchanted amulets, and supernatural powers immediately spring to mind. Hollywood loves to depict Egyptians chanting incantations to raise the dead, summon monsters, or cast inexplicable spells. But the reality is far more practical, sophisticated, and intellectually grounded than the modern imagination allows. Egyptian magic, called Heka, wasn't about fantasy or entertainment. It was a structured system for understanding the world, influencing outcomes, and maintaining cosmic balance. Let's begin with the word itself, Heka. In ancient Egyptian culture, Heka wasn't seen as mysterious or supernatural. It was a force present in nature, in humans, in words, and in ritual actions. Heka was a tool, a skill, and a means of connecting the material and spiritual worlds. Priests, healers, and skilled individuals used Heka to protect people, guide outcomes, and ensure alignment with Mayat, the fundamental principle of order, truth, and balance. In other words, magic wasn't entertainment. It was a practical method of applying knowledge and ritual to influence reality. Spells, contrary to modern misconceptions, were highly structured. Texts such as the Book of the Dead or pyramid inscriptions weren't mere superstition. They were manuals, carefully formulated to achieve specific outcomes. A spell for safe passage through the afterlife, for instance, included precise words, gestures, and symbols. Each component served a purpose, derived from centuries of observation, experimentation, and philosophical reasoning. The magic worked not because of fantasy, but because it reflected an understanding of ritual, symbolism, psychology, and social expectation. Amulets, too, are often misrepresented as mystical jewellery. Cats, scarabs, ankhs, or eyes of Horus weren't fashion statements or mystical talismans in a whimsical sense. They were protective symbols, tools of spiritual and practical power. Wearing an amulet communicated alignment with cosmic forces, protection against danger, and connection to divine principles. It's easy to look at them today and think, superstitious charm. But in ancient Egypt, these objects were a combination of art, science, and spiritual philosophy, intended to maintain balance and safeguard life. Medical practices intertwined with Heka illustrate its practical nature. Healing rituals often included incantations, prayers, and symbolic gestures. Modern audiences may assume this was primitive superstition, but it was actually sophisticated, holistic care. Words, symbols, and ritual actions influenced the patient's environment, psychology, and social context, complementing empirical remedies such as herbs, bandages, and splints. Magic, in this sense, was a method of understanding cause and effect, integrating human observation with symbolic frameworks to produce measurable results. Magic also played a central role in governance and social order. Pharaohs and priests used Heka to legitimize authority, maintain harmony, and protect the state. Ceremonial acts, public rituals, and temple practices weren't performances for entertainment. They were structured exercises to reinforce Ma'at, convey divine authority, and sustain stability. Modern portrayals of mystical rulers miss this functional reality. Pharaohs didn't wave wands to summon power. They coordinated symbols, ritual, and communication to align society, maintain order, and reinforce legitimacy. One of the most misrepresented aspects of Egyptian magic is its connection to morality and ethics. Unlike modern fantasies that separate good and evil magic, Egyptians saw Heka as inherently neutral. It could be used for protection, healing, and guidance, or misused to disrupt Ma'at and harm others. Understanding the ethical dimension is crucial. Magic wasn't chaotic or whimsical. It was a tool, and its morality depended on the user's alignment with societal and cosmic principles. This is a radical difference from Western conceptions of magic as inherently fantastical or morally absolute. Even everyday life was infused with subtle forms of Heka. Simple gestures, blessings, and protective rituals were integrated into homes, workplaces, and communities. Farmers performed rituals to ensure crop fertility. Fishermen made offerings for safe passage on the Nile. Merchants invoked protective words to secure trade. Magic wasn't hidden or secret. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, practical, functional, and deeply symbolic. Misinterpretation arises when we extract it from context, treating it as exotic or fantastical rather than part of a coherent worldview. Modern fascination with Egyptian curses, particularly those associated with tombs and mummies, is another major distortion. The famous Curse of the Pharaohs is often cited as evidence of mystical vengeance, but most of these warnings were legalistic, protective, or symbolic. Tomb inscriptions served to deter grave robbers, maintain respect for the deceased, and reinforce social and spiritual order, not to unleash supernatural terror. By viewing these curses through the lens of entertainment, we lose sight of their societal, philosophical, and ritualistic purpose. The integration of magic with religion is also key. Heka wasn't separate from worship, it was an extension of it. Rituals, offerings, and prayers were themselves applications of Heka, connecting human action with divine forces. Every act in a temple, every gesture of a priest, every recitation of words was a calibrated performance of cosmic alignment. This underscores a critical point. Egyptian magic was knowledge applied, not fantasy enacted. It was a science of influence, deeply entwined with religion, society, and philosophy. By understanding Heka in its proper context, we see ancient Egypt as a civilization that blended observation, experimentation, ritual, and symbolism into an integrated system of life, governance, and spirituality. Magic wasn't a gimmick, it was a sophisticated, rational method for navigating uncertainty, maintaining balance, and ensuring prosperity. Misunderstanding it as pure superstition or fantasy obscures the intelligence, creativity, and practical ingenuity of the civilization. Next, we'll explore another domain where myths persist, the Nile itself, not just as a river, but as the lifeblood of Egypt, a source of fertility, power, and misunderstanding. We'll uncover how modern interpretations distort the Nile's centrality, ignoring its ecological, economic, and symbolic significance. Because if death, queens, and magic reveal Egypt's sophistication, the Nile reveals the very heartbeat of civilization itself. Egypt is often pictured as endless desert, with the Nile sliced through it like a ribbon of life. Popular imagination treats the river as a backdrop, a scenic feature, or a mystical source of power for gods and pharaohs. The reality is far more intricate. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was the engine of civilization, the framework for society, and the axis around which life, economy, and culture revolved. Misunderstanding the Nile leads to misunderstanding Egypt itself. The annual flood, long celebrated in modern narratives as magical or divinely orchestrated, was in fact an essential ecological phenomenon that Egyptians observed, predicted, and utilized. The inundation brought nutrient-rich silt, making the soil fertile and supporting agriculture. Farmers didn't rely on superstition alone. They developed calendars, measured river levels, and organized labor to harness these cycles. Their survival depended on understanding, observation, and planning. The river dictated the rhythm of work, trade, and society itself. Egyptian cities and settlements weren't randomly placed. They followed the river's course, strategically positioned to maximize access to water, fertile land, and transportation. The Nile was a highway, a trade route, and a communication network. Boats transported grain, stone, and luxury goods. Merchants and officials navigated its waters to maintain connections across hundreds of miles. To view the Nile merely as scenery is to erase its functional and symbolic centrality. Life, governance, and commerce were inseparable from the river. Religion and symbolism also hinged on the Nile. Deities such as Hapi, the god of the inundation, weren't whimsical figures. They embodied essential ecological processes. Rituals honouring Hapi weren't performed out of idle superstition. They reflected gratitude, observation, and societal coordination. These ceremonies reinforced the relationship between humans, nature, and divine principles, ensuring communal understanding of the river's rhythms. By distorting these gods into caricatures, modern culture misses the profound ecological wisdom encoded in religious practice. The Nile also shaped social structures. Labour for agriculture, construction, and transport was organised around its seasonal cycles. The rise and fall of the river dictated planting, harvesting, and trading schedules. Officials, priests, and local administrators coordinated resources, labour, and logistics with remarkable precision. Civilization emerged in direct response to the river's patterns, illustrating a deep understanding of natural systems, planning, and societal integration. Even engineering and architecture were river-dependent. Canals, reservoirs, and irrigation systems demonstrate remarkable ingenuity. The Egyptians didn't rely solely on the flood. They managed it, extended its reach, and mitigated its risks. By controlling water flow, they transformed natural cycles into predictable, productive systems. Modern depictions of Egyptian engineering often highlight pyramids or temples, ignoring the equally sophisticated hydraulic and agricultural achievements that sustained the population and enabled monumental projects. The river also played a strategic role. Controlling access to the Nile meant controlling commerce, communication, and security. Pharaohs leveraged this control to maintain authority, stabilize the economy, and project power. Settlements along tributaries and canals served both practical and defensive purposes. Misinterpreting the Nile as merely a scenic or divine feature obscures its centrality to politics, logistics, and social cohesion. Beyond its physical and economic importance, the Nile inspired philosophical and cultural frameworks. It represented continuity, rhythm, and life itself. The annual inundation mirrored cycles of death and rebirth, linking everyday survival with cosmic and spiritual principles. Art, literature, and ritual frequently referenced the river as a metaphor for order, abundance, and renewal. Simplifying it to a magical river that nourishes life erases centuries of observation, management, and symbolic sophistication. Understanding the Nile also corrects another common misconception, that Egyptian civilization existed in isolation. Trade and interaction along the river connected communities, facilitated diplomacy, and allowed knowledge to flow between regions. The Nile was both artery and lifeline, integrating local, regional, and national systems. Civilization was a network, and the river was its nervous system. Ultimately, the Nile teaches a profound lesson about human adaptation, observation, and integration with nature. Ancient Egyptians didn't passively worship the river. They engaged with it intelligently, building a civilization aligned with its rhythms and potentials. Misinterpreting the river as mere divine spectacle or mystical highway distorts the very foundation of Egyptian society. Understanding the Nile in its full complexity allows us to see Egypt as a dynamic, sophisticated, and remarkably adaptive civilization. Next, we'll examine agriculture, food, and survival. How Egyptians turned the river's bounty into the backbone of empire, and how misconceptions about grain, bread, and beer obscure the technological and organizational brilliance behind feeding millions. Because if the Nile is life itself, understanding how it was harnessed shows just how ingenious the civilization truly was. Life in ancient Egypt revolved around food, more specifically, the ability to reliably produce, store, and distribute it. Modern depictions often reduce Egyptian agriculture to simplistic ideas. Pyramids built by starving workers, farmers endlessly toiling, and everyone subsisting on bread and beer. In reality, feeding millions required ingenuity, planning, and administrative sophistication that rivals any modern system. Agriculture, food production, and bureaucracy were not trivial. They were the backbone of civilization. The Nile's annual flood provided fertile soil, but controlling it was a full-time endeavour. Farmers built canals, dikes, and reservoirs to channel water, expand arable land, and protect crops from both drought and overflow. Labour wasn't haphazard. It was coordinated, seasonal, and hierarchical. Communities organised planting, tending, and harvesting according to meticulous calendars, carefully tracking lunar cycles, celestial events, and river levels. This level of coordination demonstrates observation, planning, and adaptation, on a scale that modern culture often ignores. Bread and beer weren't mere staples, they were central to both sustenance and society. Bread came in many forms, from simple loaves to elaborately baked ritual offerings. Beer was a dietary mainstay, providing calories, nutrition, and hydration. Both were also economic commodities. They could pay workers, serve as offerings to the gods, or fund civic projects. Imagine an entire economy functioning on the production, distribution, and taxation of food. Modern portrayals reduce this to they ate bread and drank beer, missing the immense logistical, technological, and social complexity involved. The role of bureaucracy was critical. Administrators and scribes meticulously recorded harvests, monitored storage, and coordinated distribution. Grain was stored in massive granaries, mapped and accounted for to prevent shortages. Taxation systems relied on precise measurements and records. Officials ensured that supplies reached not only cities but also construction projects, temples, and military expeditions. Ancient Egyptian bureaucracy was an integrated network of planning, monitoring, and enforcement. Without it, famine, unrest, or collapse would have been inevitable. Agriculture also intertwined with religion and culture. Offerings of grain, beer, and produce were central to rituals and temples. These acts were not superstitious excess. They reinforced social cohesion, aligned human labour with cosmic order, and recognized the divine principles governing fertility and life. The gods themselves were linked to harvests. Hapi oversaw the inundation, Osiris governed fertility and regeneration, and various local deities protected crops and livestock. Religion, agriculture, and governance were inseparable, forming a complex system of interdependent forces. Trade and economic exchange further demonstrate the sophistication of food management. Egypt didn't exist in isolation. The Nile facilitated internal trade, while external trade networks brought timber, oils, metals, and luxury goods. Agricultural surpluses funded commerce, temples, and monumental projects. Farmers and merchants operated in a regulated system, integrating labour, logistics, and resources across vast distances. Popular imagination misses this entirely, preferring dramatic, static depictions of pharaohs or peasant labourers, ignoring the organisational genius behind feeding and sustaining a civilization. Storage techniques were also advanced. Granaries were designed to protect against pests, moisture, and spoilage. Archaeologists have found precise architectural features, ventilation systems, and compartmentalised designs that demonstrate knowledge of preservation and efficiency. Modern narratives reduce grain to heaps of food, while ignoring centuries of experimentation and refinement that ensured survival, economic stability, and the ability to undertake monumental projects. Even small details, like baking techniques, milling methods, and beer fermentation, reflect technological observation and innovation. Egyptians experimented with grain varieties, tools, and processes to optimize yield and quality. Food production wasn't random or primitive. It was a continuous process of improvement and adaptation, deeply integrated with society, economy, and governance. Modern depictions, by contrast, flatten it into simplistic tropes that obscure the complexity and brilliance of these systems. Understanding agriculture and bureaucracy also clarifies misconceptions about labour. Pyramid builders, temple workers, and artisans weren't starving slaves magically compelled to work. They were part of a structured economy, paid with food, clothing, and shelter. Labour was organised, managed, and incentivised. Workers had seasonal cycles, medical care, and social support. Modern myths of mass exploitation obscure the reality of a highly organised workforce capable of achieving feats of engineering, construction, and art unparalleled in human history. Ultimately, harvests, bread, and bureaucracy demonstrate that ancient Egypt's genius wasn't limited to monumental architecture or religious symbolism. It was embedded in the everyday, in the ability to feed millions, maintain order, and coordinate vast social, economic and religious systems. Civilization was sustained through observation, planning and management, and this reality is far more impressive than the oversimplified bread and beer narratives we've inherited. Next, we'll dive into craft, artisanship and material culture, how Egyptians transformed raw resources into functional and symbolic objects. We'll explore how modern myths about gold, jewellery and art obscure the deep technological skill, precision and societal integration that underpinned these creations. Because if agriculture shows organisational genius, artisanship shows technical brilliance and creativity at an unparalleled scale. Egyptian civilization wasn't built solely on the shoulders of pharaohs, priests or farmers. Its brilliance radiated through the hands of artisans, the sculptors, metal workers, painters and craftsmen who transformed raw materials into objects of stunning functionality, beauty and symbolic power. Modern depictions often reduce Egyptian art to gaudy gold jewellery, rigid statues and decorative tombs. The reality is far more sophisticated. Egyptian artisans combined technical skill, mathematical precision, symbolic understanding and social coordination in ways that modern audiences rarely appreciate. Consider gold, one of the most iconic materials associated with Egypt. Hollywood and pop culture often portray it as treasure, hoarded in tombs and sought after for its glitter alone. But gold wasn't just wealth. It was symbolic, functional, and technologically challenging. Egyptians extracted gold from mines in Nubia, refined it with methods requiring heat control, alloy knowledge, and metallurgy skills. They hammered, cast, and engraved it with precision, creating jewellery, ritual objects, and even inlays for furniture or temple doors. Gold signified divine essence, immortality, and cosmic alignment. Its production required understanding chemistry, temperature, and metallurgy, skills that rival modern techniques in ingenuity. Stonework provides another example of technical brilliance. Monuments, temples, statues, and obelisks weren't carved by accident or magic. Artisans selected stone for durability and aesthetic properties, transported massive blocks with sleds, rollers, and manpower, and carved with copper and stone tools using advanced techniques. Statues, often depicted as rigid in popular imagination, followed precise proportions, symbolism, and canonical rules. Every angle, every pose, and every inscription communicated hierarchy, function, or spiritual meaning. Modern interpretations often miss that these objects were both functional and symbolic, integrating mathematics, geometry, and cultural literacy. Painting and reliefs further demonstrate sophistication. Egyptian artists didn't paint randomly. They applied strict conventions to communicate hierarchy, function, and narrative. Scale, colour, and placement had meaning. The size of a figure indicated status. Colours conveyed symbolic properties, and scenes communicated stories or religious principles. Far from primitive art, these works were a highly codified language, mastered through apprenticeship, practice, and careful observation. Misunderstanding them as rigid or decorative reduces a complex visual language to mere aesthetics. Woodwork, pottery, and textiles were equally advanced. Egyptians produced furniture, boats, tools, and storage vessels with functional design, durability, and style. Pottery was standardized for storage and transport, demonstrating attention to geometry, volume, and material properties. Textiles, dyed with plant and mineral pigments, required skill in spinning, weaving, and patterning. Every object reflected a deep integration of knowledge, utility, and symbolism. Popular narratives often ignore these innovations, focusing instead on monumental stone or gold for dramatic effect. Even small details like jewellery design or amulet creation reflect the intersection of technology, symbolism, and social communication. Scarabs, ankhs, and protective charms weren't random decorations. They were carefully crafted to convey status, protect, or connect the wearer to divine forces. Artisans had to understand materials, symbolism, and social conventions to produce items that were both functional and meaningful. Modern pop culture often fetishizes the end product while ignoring the skill, intellect, and precision involved. Artisanship also highlights social organization. Craftspeople were often part of guild-like structures, apprenticed from youth, and coordinated with priests, scribes, and administrators. Monumental projects required collaboration, planning, and resource management. A single statue or temple relief involved a network of designers, toolmakers, labourers, and supervisors. Modern myths of solitary genius or magical intervention completely overlook the collective knowledge and social coordination behind these works. Trade in raw materials further underscores Egyptian ingenuity. Stone, metals, pigments, and rare woods were often imported from distant regions. Sourcing, transporting, and processing these materials demanded logistical skill, economic planning, and diplomatic engagement. Every artifact tells a story not only of aesthetic and symbolic achievement, but also of technological mastery and societal coordination. The glittering tombs and temples were visible signs of invisible systems of knowledge, labour, and planning. Ultimately, the work of Egyptian artisans reveals a civilization defined not just by grand architecture or pharaonic power, but by technical brilliance, symbolic intelligence, and creative integration. Gold, stone, paint, and wood were more than materials. They were mediums for expressing ideology, authority, and spiritual order. Misrepresenting these objects as mere treasure or exotic decoration obscures the human ingenuity, precision, and intellectual sophistication that made them possible. Next, we'll turn to the misunderstood world of Egyptian science and mathematics, how they measured, calculated, and engineered in ways that modern observers often underestimate. If artisans reveal creativity and precision, science shows how Egyptians combined observation, experimentation, and practical knowledge to sustain an empire and leave a legacy that still astonishes today. Egyptian civilization is often celebrated for monuments, gods, and pharaohs, but the true genius lies in their mastery of observation, measurement, and engineering. Modern narratives either oversimplify or mythologize this skill. Pyramids are said to be built by slaves or aligned by aliens, while temples are described as mysterious structures. The reality is far more impressive. Egyptians applied science, mathematics, and engineering with precision, foresight, and practical genius to create infrastructure, monuments, and daily systems that have endured millennia. Consider the pyramids. Popular imagination imagines immense labour driven by coercion, yet modern research suggests skilled labourers organised through a sophisticated logistical system. Planning required knowledge of geometry, measurement, and structural mechanics. Blocks of stone were quarried, transported, and precisely placed using ramps, levers, and manpower. The alignment of the pyramids to cardinal points wasn't random. It involved astronomical observation, surveying techniques, and practical geometry. The ancients understood principles of weight distribution, angles, and stability, long before formalized equations existed. Engineering prowess extended beyond monuments. Temples, canals, granaries, and irrigation systems demonstrate mastery over materials, water management, and construction. Canals regulated the Nile's floodwaters, extending agricultural potential and protecting settlements. Granaries were carefully designed to preserve grain against moisture, pests, and spoilage. Even simple structures like houses incorporated understanding of materials, airflow, and sun exposure. Egyptian engineering wasn't accidental. It reflected observation, experimentation, and systematic refinement over centuries. Mathematics was integral to this ingenuity. Hieroglyphic numerals and fractions allowed precise measurements for land, construction and trade. Surveyors, called mensors, measured fields after the annual flood using ropes and geometry, ensuring fair taxation and proper land allocation. Calculations for volume, area and alignment weren't abstract exercises. They were essential for survival, governance and monumental architecture. Mathematics was applied, practical and integrated into daily life, not just a theoretical curiosity. Astronomy played a similarly critical role. Egyptians observed celestial bodies to regulate calendars, predict floods, and guide construction. The heliacal rising of Sirius, for example, marked the coming inundation of the Nile, informing agricultural and religious cycles. Temples and pyramids were often aligned with stars or solstices, reflecting both symbolic and practical knowledge. Ancient observation wasn't superstition. It was careful, empirical, and encoded into culture, religion, and civic life. Medicine and anatomy also reveal applied science. Egyptians understood the human body through mummification, surgical practices, and careful observation. They developed treatments for injuries, infections, and diseases using herbs, splints, and procedural interventions. Their approach integrated empirical observation, ritual, and pharmacology, producing a medical system that balanced science and spirituality. Misunderstandings in modern depictions reduce this knowledge to magical remedies, erasing centuries of practical experimentation and refinement. Even metallurgy demonstrates systemic knowledge. Gold, copper, and bronze were refined and alloyed with precision. Toolmaking required understanding hardness, temperature, and material behaviour. Artisans combined this with engineering to produce functional tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects. Knowledge of materials was empirical, cumulative, and integral to social and technological systems. These innovations weren't isolated achievements. They were part of an interwoven network of observation, experimentation, and application. Water management alone illustrates the integration of science, engineering, and governance. Egyptians measured river levels, predicted inundations, and designed channels to distribute water efficiently. Communities coordinated labour, maintained infrastructure, and regulated usage. Failure meant famine or social unrest. Success sustained cities, trade, and monumental construction. Modern interpretations often simplify this as rivers flooded, people planted crops, overlooking centuries of engineering, planning, and observation. The common thread across these domains is systematic knowledge applied to practical problems. Egyptian science was not abstract. It was inseparable from daily life, survival, and governance. Every monument, canal, granary, and calendar was a product of applied intelligence, experimentation, and societal coordination. Misrepresenting this genius as magical or primitive obscures one of the civilization's most remarkable achievements. In understanding Egyptian science, engineering, and mathematics, we begin to see how the civilization sustained itself, built wonders, and influenced future generations. These achievements weren't anomalies. They were the product of careful observation, collaborative expertise, and cumulative knowledge, refined over centuries. Modern myths of slavery, mysticism, or alien intervention diminish this human ingenuity and erase the lessons embedded in Egyptian practice. Next, we'll dive into the military, defence, and strategy of ancient Egypt, how armies, fortifications, and tactical innovations secured and expanded the civilization. If engineering and mathematics reveal practical genius, military organisation demonstrates how Egyptians applied knowledge to protect, control, and project power across centuries of dynamic political landscapes. Egypt is often imagined as a passive civilization, cradled by deserts and rivers, immune to conflict because of its natural barriers. Movies and popular culture portray pharaohs as ceremonial rulers, rarely engaged in military matters. The reality is very different. Egypt maintained sophisticated armies, fortified borders, and strategic approaches to warfare that were integral to its survival and expansion. Military organization, planning, and tactical insight reveal another layer of Egyptian brilliance that is routinely misunderstood or overlooked. Egyptian soldiers were not simply mobs of conscripts. Armies were structured, trained, and equipped with specialized roles. Infantry, archers, chariotry, and naval units each had unique responsibilities. Soldiers trained in formations, weapon handling, and coordinated maneuvers. Chariots, for example, weren't just flashy vehicles. They were mobile command platforms, requiring skilled drivers, archers, and support teams. Training, logistics, and discipline turned Egyptian armies into efficient, flexible forces capable of defending territory and projecting power. Fortifications were equally sophisticated. Cities, borders, and strategic points were protected by walls, towers, and gates designed for both defense and deterrence. Defensive structures integrated observation, controlled access, and layered security, reflecting careful understanding of terrain, resource management, and military engineering. These were not symbolic barriers. They were practical, functional systems ensuring that even a small number of defenders could repel larger forces. The Nile itself played a strategic role. Controlling river access meant controlling trade, communication, and troop movement. Fortresses and garrisons were positioned along key points to monitor traffic, enforce authority, and respond to threats. Egyptian military planners understood geography, hydrology, and logistics as essential components of strategy. Modern depictions that ignore these aspects reduce military organization to drama or myth, missing the deep integration of natural and social intelligence. Egyptians also understood supply lines and resource management. Armies required food, water, weapons, and equipment, coordinated across vast distances. Administrative records reveal careful planning for campaigns, provisioning of troops, and allocation of resources. Strategic foresight included seasonal planning, coordination with local populations, and preparation for extended engagements. Success in battle was not only about skill, it was about organization, intelligence, and applied knowledge. Tactics evolved over time. Early armies focused on infantry and archery, while later periods emphasized chariots, specialized weaponry, and coordinated maneuvers. Egyptian generals studied terrain, enemy behavior, and logistical constraints to maximize efficiency and minimize risk. Battles were not chaotic clashes, but structured engagements with clear objectives, roles, and contingencies. Misconceptions of primitive warfare obscure this sophisticated strategic thinking. Egyptian diplomacy often complemented military capability. Treaties, alliances, and strategic marriages were used to expand influence or neutralize threats without bloodshed. Military power and negotiation were intertwined, reflecting a holistic approach to security and governance. Pharaohs who neglected strategy, logistics, or diplomacy risked both territorial loss and internal instability, demonstrating the critical connection between military planning and political authority. Weaponry and armour were also products of careful technological development. Spears, bows, shields, and chariots were optimized for effectiveness, durability, and tactical application. Materials were chosen based on function, availability, and environmental conditions. Artisans, engineers, and military planners collaborated to produce tools that were both practical and reliable. Modern media often romanticizes these weapons or depicts them inaccurately, failing to capture the calculated thought and experimentation behind their design. Even military culture emphasized discipline, training, and morale. Soldiers were supported by logistical networks, religious rituals, and leadership structures that reinforced cohesion and commitment. War wasn't simply about brute force. It was about coordinated action, ethical standards, and structured hierarchies. Modern depictions that reduce Egyptian armies to untrained mobs erase this disciplined sophistication. Understanding military organization illuminates how Egypt maintained stability, defended borders, and expanded influence over centuries. Warfare wasn't peripheral. It was central to political, economic, and social strategy. Pharaohs relied on skilled generals, trained soldiers, and integrated planning to protect resources, project power, and maintain authority. Misrepresenting Egyptian military capability distorts perceptions of the civilization's resilience, adaptability, and strategic brilliance. Next, we'll explore religion, priests, and temple economics, how spiritual institutions wielded power, organized resources, and shaped daily life. If engineering and military strategy demonstrate practical genius, religion reveals the integration of ideology, administration, and societal coordination that made Egypt sustainable, stable, and symbolically coherent across millennia. Temples in ancient Egypt were more than places of worship. They were centers of power, administration, and wealth. Modern depictions often reduce priests to mystical figures performing ritual for show, or temples to tourist attractions brimming with statues and gold. In reality, religious institutions were deeply intertwined with economics, politics, and societal management, functioning as hubs that shaped daily life and long-term stability. Priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were administrators, educators, and managers of enormous resources. They oversaw land, livestock, workshops, and labour associated with temple estates, effectively running parallel economies. Temples owned large tracts of land, which were cultivated to produce grain, vegetables, and other resources to sustain both the institution and the surrounding community. Workers, farmers, and artisans were coordinated under temple supervision, ensuring efficiency, accountability, and alignment with religious priorities. Wealth wasn't hoarded for spectacle. It fueled practical governance, rituals, and infrastructure. Economics extended beyond land. Temples managed granaries, storage facilities, and trade networks. Surplus grain and goods were distributed to priests, workers, and local populations, or used to support state projects. Temples issued rations, provided employment, and maintained resources for festivals, religious ceremonies, and social functions. This network created stability, integrating spiritual authority with material management. Modern misconceptions of temples as purely ceremonial spaces obscure the practical and economic genius embedded in these institutions. Religious rituals themselves were highly organized. Festivals involved detailed planning, scheduling performers, coordinating offerings, and mobilizing entire communities. Large-scale celebrations such as Opet or Sed festivals reinforced social cohesion and affirmed the pharaoh's divine mandate. Priests ensured these events ran smoothly, blending ritual with administration and demonstrating organizational acumen that rivaled modern event planning. What appears as mystical spectacle was actually complex logistical coordination executed with precision and foresight. Education and literacy were also concentrated in temples. Priests trained scribes, mathematicians, astronomers, and administrators, passing down knowledge essential to governance, economy, and engineering. Writing, record-keeping, and calculation were vital for managing resources, land, labour, and trade. Temples functioned as intellectual centres, preserving knowledge across generations and enabling continuity in administration and societal organisation. Modern narratives often overlook this educational role, focusing on superstition rather than systemic knowledge transfer. Political influence was inseparable from religious authority. Priests advised pharaohs, mediated disputes, and reinforced ideological structures that legitimized rule. They interpreted divine will, oversaw oracles, and guided decisions affecting trade, diplomacy, and security. temples were not passive symbols. They were active participants in shaping policy, governance, and social norms. This influence extended beyond spiritual matters, embedding priests deeply in the practical management of society. Artisans and workshops operated within temple complexes, producing objects for ritual, administration, and trade. Jewellery, statues, amulets, and ceremonial tools were manufactured under temple supervision, blending technical skill, symbolic meaning, and economic purpose. These items served religious functions while also circulating as commodities, illustrating the intersection of faith, craft, and economic strategy. Modern depictions that separate religion from labour or wealth miss this integrated system. Temples also served as financial hubs. They collected tithes, managed debts, and facilitated redistribution of goods. This economic role was fundamental to social stability, ensuring resources were available for essential functions, construction projects, and crisis management. Misunderstanding temples as purely mystical spaces erases recognition of their role in sustaining civilization through administrative and financial networks. Even land management reflected advanced organization. Temple estates were surveyed, taxed, and recorded. Production quotas, labor allocation, and storage systems required detailed knowledge of agriculture, logistics, and accounting. Priests acted as managers, auditors, and strategists, ensuring resources were optimized to support spiritual, social, and political objectives. This integration of faith and administration demonstrates that Egyptian religion was inseparable from practical governance. By combining economic management, education, artistic production, and political influence, temples became engines of civilization. They exemplify how ideology, administration, and societal coordination were integrated into daily life. The success of Egyptian society depended not only on pharaohs or armies, but also on these institutions that harmonized spiritual authority with practical governance, ensuring stability and continuity over centuries. Ancient Egyptian society was structured around cycles of the Nile, the seasons, and religious observances. Festivals and rituals weren't just entertainment or spiritual show. They were central to social cohesion, cultural continuity, and governance. Modern depictions often reduce Egyptian celebrations to spectacle, dancing, music, and parades for tourists or cinematic effect. In reality, these events were meticulously organized instruments of community, politics, and ideology. Festivals served multiple purposes. They reinforced the pharaoh's divine authority, honored gods, regulated agricultural cycles, and integrated communities. The Opet festival, for example, involved transporting statues of gods from one temple to another, accompanied by priests, musicians, and citizens. Every movement, chant, and offering was coordinated to reaffirm cosmic and social order. This wasn't a chaotic procession. It was a public reinforcement of political legitimacy, religious devotion, and community identity. Rituals were equally systematic. Daily temple rites, offerings, and prayers maintained cosmic balance and ensured Ma'at, the principle of truth, order, and harmony. Priests performed actions with precise timing, gestures, and words, reflecting centuries of codified practice. The average Egyptian understood that participation or observance contributed to societal stability. Modern perceptions of rituals as mystical or purely symbolic miss the embedded social function. They created shared understanding, moral alignment, and cultural consistency. Community involvement was crucial. Festivals engaged people of all social strata, from pharaohs to farmers. Labourers, artisans, scribes, and priests all participated in roles aligned with skill, status, and function. Music, dance, and theatrical elements weren't frivolous. They facilitated engagement, communication, and the reinforcement of values. These activities also provided education. Myths, history, and ethics were communicated through performance, ensuring collective memory and societal cohesion. Agriculture and seasonal cycles were intertwined with ritual. The inundation of the Nile dictated planting schedules, and festivals marked important transitions. Religious ceremonies invoked divine protection for crops, livestock, and trade. Participation in these rituals strengthened communal understanding of natural cycles, linking survival to spiritual observance. Far from superstition, this was an early form of societal integration through observation, symbolism, and shared experience. Festivals also had political implications. Public displays of wealth, ceremonial acts, and processions reinforced the power of the state. Pharaohs were visibly aligned with gods, demonstrating authority, legitimacy, and control over resources. Citizens witnessing these displays internalized social hierarchies and civic expectations. Modern portrayals often emphasize pageantry, while ignoring how these events functioned as tools of governance, communication, and social reinforcement. Economic organization was embedded in festival planning. Food, drink, costumes, and materials had to be produced, distributed, and managed efficiently. Temples coordinated supplies, artisans manufactured ceremonial items, and administrators ensured logistics. Festivals were thus large-scale operations requiring planning, foresight, and collaboration, demonstrating administrative sophistication alongside religious function. Treating festivals as simple spectacle erases the incredible coordination and societal knowledge required. Education and cultural transmission were embedded in ritual and celebration. Myths, moral lessons, and historical narratives were enacted for audiences of all ages and statuses. This preserved knowledge across generations and reinforced identity. Through music, dance, and recitation, communities internalized principles of governance, social responsibility, and ethical conduct. Modern interpretations often separate ritual from education, missing the holistic integration of culture, religion, and society. Artistic expression was also intertwined. Music, visual art, and performance were not purely decorative. They conveyed meaning, guided perception, and reinforced spiritual and societal principles. Costumes, masks, and painted imagery communicated status, divinity, and moral order. Participation in these events allowed individuals to experience and internalize complex cultural narratives. The festivals were living classrooms, social glue, and spiritual practice all at once. Ultimately, Egyptian festivals and rituals exemplify how society maintained cohesion, continuity, and stability. They weren't isolated spectacles, but integrated systems of education, social reinforcement, economic coordination, and spiritual alignment. Misrepresenting them as exotic or merely entertaining obscures the profound sophistication of Egyptian social organization. Ancient Egyptian gods are some of the most iconic figures in human history. Ra with his radiant sun disk, Anubis with his jackal head, and Osiris ruling the underworld. Modern culture often interprets them as caricatures, monsters, or supernatural beings with fantastical powers. Movies, comics, and memes reduce gods to entertainment, but the truth is far more nuanced. Egyptian deities were not mythical exaggerations. They were conceptual frameworks for understanding nature, society, morality, and the cosmos. Gods represented forces, principles, and cycles rather than literal creatures. Ra wasn't just a sun god. He embodied the sun's life-giving energy, cosmic order, and continuity of time. Worship wasn't superstition. It was a method of aligning human action with natural cycles. Anubis wasn't merely a macabre figure presiding over death. He symbolized protection, ritual precision, and transition, guiding individuals through the complex spiritual journey of mortality. Modern interpretations often strip these figures of their intellectual and symbolic function, leaving only visual spectacle. The relationships between gods reflected cosmology and ethics. Stories of conflict, cooperation, or trickery among deities weren't entertainment. They encoded moral lessons, explanations for natural phenomena, and societal ideals. Myths like the Osiris cycle illustrated death, rebirth, and ethical order. The narratives conveyed principles about justice, leadership, and communal responsibility, showing Egyptians how to navigate life and understand the world. Treating these myths as fairy tales erases centuries of philosophical and cultural insight. Polytheism didn't mean randomness or contradiction. Each deity had specific domains, responsibilities, and symbolic meaning. Temples, rituals, and priestly activities ensured that these principles were observed and balanced in daily life. Egyptians didn't worship gods indiscriminately. They participated in systems of order that connected spiritual understanding with political governance, agriculture, and social practice. Misinterpreting gods as mere figures of fantasy ignores the structural role they played in maintaining civilization. Art and iconography reinforced understanding. Animal heads, colours, and symbolic objects were not whimsical. They encoded characteristics, functions, and cosmic significance. The jackal of Anubis represented vigilance, the ibis of Thoth represented wisdom, and the crocodile of Sobek symbolised strength and fertility. Every depiction conveyed a precise message, integrating communication, education, and ritual function. Modern depictions often reduce this rich visual language to spectacle, ignoring centuries of codified symbolism. Gods also served as moral exemplars. Stories of divine judgment, ethical dilemmas, and cosmic balance provided guidance for human behaviour. Pharaohs, priests, and citizens aligned themselves with divine principles, reinforcing Ma'at, truth, order, and harmony. Deviations from these principles weren't punished through fantastical curses. They had social, spiritual, and practical consequences that maintained societal cohesion. Viewing Egyptian gods as merely supernatural diminishes their role as tools for ethical, philosophical, and political guidance. Even the idea of anthropomorphism requires nuance. Egyptian gods combined human and animal traits not to inspire fear or whimsy, but to convey complex characteristics, strengths, and roles. Human features enabled recognition, emotion, and relatability, while animal features encoded instinctual, natural, or cosmic qualities. This symbolic system communicated multifaceted concepts visually, making abstract ideas tangible and culturally accessible. Priests, scribes, and artists acted as interpreters of divine knowledge. They translated complex cosmology into rituals, texts, art, and social practices. Ordinary citizens engaged with these systems through festivals, offerings, and observance, internalizing ethical, cosmological, and social norms. Modern culture often focuses on the gods themselves while neglecting the networks of knowledge, education, and social integration that maintained their relevance. Popular myths about Egyptian gods, curses, revenge, and magical powers largely arise from misunderstanding these symbolic and conceptual frameworks. Hollywood often depicts deities as capricious supernatural beings acting whimsically. The truth is that Egyptian gods functioned within a coherent system designed to explain, regulate, and inspire human action in alignment with the world's natural and moral order. Misinterpretation transforms a sophisticated cultural framework into fantasy, obscuring centuries of intellectual, spiritual, and societal development. The Egyptians didn't need fantastical tales to understand the universe. Their gods provided a structured lens for comprehending natural cycles, ethical responsibilities, and human potential. By stripping these figures of context and depth, modern interpretations miss the genius embedded in mythology, symbolism, and civic philosophy. Understanding the gods on their terms reveals a civilization capable of integrating spirituality, morality, and practical knowledge into a coherent and enduring worldview. Egyptian tombs have captivated imaginations for centuries. Modern depictions often frame them as treasure-filled death traps, haunted by curses and brimming with gold to lure greedy explorers. Movies, books, and media frequently exaggerate these legends, presenting tombs as mystical spaces protected by supernatural forces. In reality, tombs were highly practical, symbolic, and carefully designed spaces that reflected religious beliefs, social status, and cultural priorities rather than magical hazard zones. Tombs were fundamentally expressions of preparation for the afterlife. Egyptians believed that life continued after death in a spiritual form, and the tomb served as a secure home for the deceased's body, possessions, and spiritual essence. The care taken in construction, decoration, and placement was about permanence and ritual correctness. Every chamber, corridor, and inscription was deliberately planned to preserve identity, enable spiritual transition, and maintain cosmic harmony. Popular myths about hidden treasures and deadly traps obscure this meticulous planning and symbolic intent. Curses, often sensationalized in modern culture, were not mystical spells to strike intruders with lightning. They were warnings, legal statements, and protective measures embedded in text. Tomb inscriptions commonly instructed respect, warned against theft, or reminded readers of social and religious consequences. The so-called Curse of the Pharaohs is largely a product of sensational reporting in the 19th and 20th centuries, not an ancient Egyptian magical practice designed to terrorize outsiders. These inscriptions served practical, moral, and ritual functions rather than supernatural vengeance. The architecture of tombs demonstrates remarkable engineering and planning. From the mastabas of the early dynasties to the complex chambers of the Valley of the Kings, every element reflected functional, symbolic, and security considerations. Narrow corridors, false doors, and secret chambers were designed to protect remains and sacred objects while maintaining ritual precision. These features were clever solutions to practical challenges, not magical inventions or traps in the sense imagined by Hollywood. Decoration and inscriptions were central to tomb function. Walls covered with hieroglyphs, paintings, and carvings weren't mere art. They communicated instructions for the afterlife, illustrated journeys, and recorded the deceased's achievements. Scenes of offerings, daily activities, or protective deities served to provide the deceased with spiritual support and sustenance. Every image was both symbolic and functional, ensuring that cultural and religious knowledge accompanied the individual into the afterlife. The objects placed in tombs were equally practical and symbolic. Funerary goods included furniture, food, clothing, and ritual items necessary for the afterlife. Gold and jewellery were not simply treasure, they represented status, divine alignment, and permanence. Amulets, scarabs, and ritual tools served as protective or functional items in a spiritual sense, reflecting belief systems and practical symbolic thinking rather than mystical power. Modern depictions reduce these objects to greed-driven targets for adventurers, missing their true significance. Mummification itself is a perfect example of combining science, ritual, and symbolic function. The process preserved the body for spiritual continuity, employing chemicals, resins, and careful techniques derived from empirical observation. Modern myths often frame mummies as cursed zombies or magical monsters, but in reality mummification was a precise, practical, and deeply meaningful ritual designed to ensure identity, dignity, and spiritual integrity. It demonstrates how Egyptians applied knowledge and observation to religious practice. Even the choice of tomb location reflected strategy, culture, and symbolism. Necropolises, like Giza and the Valley of the Kings, were selected for geological stability, alignment with religious or celestial principles, and protection from flooding or erosion. Tomb placement was guided by practical, religious, and logistical reasoning, not whim or magic. Modern legends of hidden mystical valleys exaggerate and mystify what were carefully considered decisions rooted in engineering, spirituality, and societal norms. Tomb construction and maintenance also involved extensive labour organisation. Artisans, architects, priests, and workers collaborated under precise plans, schedules, and supervision. Resources, tools, and food were carefully managed, demonstrating societal coordination at an impressive scale. This was an enormous civil and religious project, executed with purpose and oversight, rather than a chaotic process that relied on mystical intervention or supernatural assistance. Understanding tombs in this way shifts perception from superstition and fantasy to practical ingenuity, cultural depth, and spiritual sophistication. They are monuments to social structure, religious belief, technical skill, and cultural continuity, rather than cursed treasure chambers or cinematic death traps. Modern fascination with danger and treasure has obscured the nuanced genius embedded in Egyptian mortuary practices. Egyptian history is often told through the lens of male pharaohs, from Khufu to Ramses, leaving female rulers as footnotes or exotic curiosities. Modern narratives frequently depict royal women as passive, decorative, or manipulative figures in the shadows of kings. In reality, women of the royal family exercise political influence, religious authority, and economic power in ways that were both formalized and socially recognized. Misunderstanding their roles distorts our perception of Egyptian governance and culture. Queens and royal women were not symbolic ornaments, they were integral to dynastic stability. Through marriage, lineage, and motherhood, they ensured continuity of the royal line, maintained alliances, and reinforced legitimacy. Hatshepsut, for example, ruled as pharaoh in her own right, commissioning monumental architecture, trade expeditions, and religious reforms. Her reign illustrates that female rulers could wield authority equivalent to their male counterparts, challenging modern myths that underestimate their political agency. Royal women also held religious authority. Many served as priestesses or high-ranking participants in temple rituals. Their presence and action were essential for ceremonies, divine communication, and maintaining mayat, societal and cosmic balance. These roles were not symbolic or ornamental. They were institutionalized, powerful, and central to the functioning of both religious and political life. Modern depictions of queens as mere charmers or seductresses obscure this integrated influence. Economic influence was another area where royal women exercised power. Temple donations, land holdings, and administrative oversight often passed through royal female figures. They managed estates, oversaw resources, and directed artisans, influencing both material wealth and labour distribution. Modern narratives tend to ignore this aspect, framing royal women solely in terms of relationships or intrigue, rather than as active participants in governance and economy. Education and literacy played a critical role in royal women's influence. They were trained in administration, writing, and ritual practice, enabling them to participate fully in government and religious life. Knowledge allowed them to read, interpret, and act on laws, records, and sacred texts. Misconceptions that women were peripheral to decision-making erased the significance of these intellectual and administrative capabilities. Symbolism reinforced status and authority. Royal women were depicted with regalia, crowns, and insignia, not as decoration, but to communicate divine alignment, political authority, and ceremonial function. Artistic conventions codified rank, influence, and participation in governance. Modern interpretations frequently misread these symbols as mere embellishment, ignoring their communicative and legitimizing purpose. Marriage and familial alliances were not just personal matters, they were strategic instruments of diplomacy. Royal women connected dynasties, negotiated political relationships, and ensured stability across regions. Misrepresenting them as passive consorts removes the strategic sophistication inherent in these arrangements. Queens and princesses were actors in governance, capable of shaping policy, succession, and international relations. Influence also extended to cultural and architectural patronage. Women like Nefertari and Hatshepsut commissioned temples, monuments, and artistic projects that reflected religious devotion, political authority, and cultural legacy. These acts were both symbolic and practical, demonstrating resource management, organizational skill, and long-term planning. Modern portrayals often downplay the significance of these contributions, reducing monumental achievements to extensions of male rulers' power. Even within the domestic sphere, royal women wielded influence that intersected with governance. Education, mentorship, and household management allowed them to cultivate social networks, train heirs, and direct labour and resources effectively. Power was exercised through multiple channels: ceremonial, administrative, economic, and symbolic. Modern myths that separate women from influence ignore the multifaceted nature of their authority. By understanding royal women's roles in governance, religion, economy, and culture, we see a more accurate and nuanced picture of Egyptian civilization. Far from passive figures or background ornaments, they were active participants, shaping dynastic continuity, societal stability, and cultural legacy. Misrepresenting them as decorative or manipulative distorts history and undervalues their enduring impact on one of the world's most remarkable civilizations. Ancient Egypt is famous for its focus on the afterlife, but popular imagination often distorts this focus. Movies and books depict elaborate tombs, endless treasures, and mystical rituals performed purely for spiritual effect. The reality is that the afterlife was deeply integrated with economy, labour, and societal organisation. Egyptians treated spiritual preparation as an extension of practical resource management, not merely superstition. Preparation for the afterlife involved the accumulation and management of goods, labour, and knowledge. Tombs required materials, artisans, and planning, creating a network of employment and trade that extended far beyond the deceased. Funerary goods, mummies, ritual texts, and amulets were not randomly produced. They were carefully commissioned, standardized, and crafted according to precise religious and symbolic protocols. This created a microeconomy surrounding spiritual preparation, linking artisans, priests, and administrators in a coordinated system. Food offerings played a central role in the afterlife economy. Egyptians believed the spirit required sustenance, which was provided symbolically through preserved foods, bread, beer, and even representations in tomb paintings. Granaries, storage systems, and agricultural labour were mobilised to support both the living and the spiritual economy. Temples and tomb administrators coordinated resources, ensuring that provisions were available for ritual consumption, ceremonial feasts, and ongoing spiritual maintenance. The production of ritual goods and offerings also illustrates technological sophistication. Amulets, statues, and ceremonial items required specialized artisans who understood metallurgy, stone carving, painting, and symbolic conventions. These objects were manufactured with precision and intention, combining functional durability with spiritual efficacy. What modern myths interpret as magical embellishment was actually a sophisticated system of production, supply, and quality control. Priests acted as regulators and facilitators of the afterlife economy. They oversaw the production, distribution, and consecration of goods, ensuring compliance with religious norms and symbolic protocols. Administrative records from temples and necropolises reveal meticulous accounting of resources, labour, and materials. These records were not ritualistic curiosities. They were central to sustaining both spiritual and societal order, preventing mismanagement and maintaining continuity over generations. Even burial locations and tomb architecture reflect economic and social considerations. Placement, size, and design required planning, resource allocation, and logistical coordination. Tombs were strategically located to maximize protection, align with religious principles, and facilitate ritual activity. Modern depictions of tombs as mystical treasure houses ignore the practical reasoning embedded in every decision, from stone selection to chamber layout. Trade and taxation intersected with the afterlife economy. Resources used in tombs and rituals were often sourced from distant regions, requiring trade networks, transportation, and logistical planning. The state and temple systems ensured that goods reached their destinations, integrating spiritual preparation into broader economic and administrative frameworks. Spiritual goods were simultaneously sacred symbols, labour products, and economic instruments. The writing of funerary texts, like the Book of the Dead, demonstrates the intellectual and administrative complexity of the afterlife economy. These texts provided instructions for navigating the spiritual realm, and their production involves scribes, artists, and priests coordinating to ensure accuracy and ritual efficacy. Misunderstanding them as purely mystical ignores their practical function, guiding the deceased, organising ritual knowledge, and codifying cultural values for successive generations. Participation in the afterlife economy also reinforced social hierarchies. Pharaohs, nobles, and high-ranking priests controlled resources and commissioning power, while artisans, labourers, and scribes executed plans. This system provided employment, stabilised society, and reinforced legitimacy. Modern myths focusing on wealth and curses miss the interconnectedness of labour, management, and spiritual preparation that made the afterlife economy functional and socially meaningful. Ultimately, the Egyptian afterlife was not a detached spiritual fantasy. It was a structured, resource-driven, and highly coordinated extension of daily life. Spiritual commerce blended religion, economy, technology, and administration into an integrated system that supported culture, employment, and continuity. Understanding this framework allows us to see the civilization not as obsessed with magic, but as profoundly organised, practical, and visionary in its approach to mortality and legacy. Pharaohs are often depicted in modern culture as god-kings ruling with absolute power, surrounded by servile courtiers, or acting as enigmatic figures performing ceremonial duties. Movies, books, and popular media exaggerate their mystique, presenting them as either omnipotent tyrants or mystical, almost supernatural figures. The reality is far more nuanced. Pharaohs were complex political actors who balanced governance, diplomacy, religion, and administration in ways that required skill, strategy, and constant attention to societal dynamics. Pharaohs were central to governance, but they were not omnipotent in isolation. Ancient Egypt was a vast society with multiple administrative layers: viziers, regional governors, priests and scribes, all played roles in implementing policy, collecting taxes, and maintaining order. Pharaohs relied on this network, delegating responsibilities while retaining ultimate authority over decisions. Misrepresenting them as solitary rulers ignores the intricate bureaucratic system that made Egypt sustainable over millennia. Religion and political authority were deeply intertwined. Pharaohs were considered divine intermediaries, responsible for upholding Ma'at, truth, order, and cosmic balance. This divine mandate wasn't simply symbolic, it structured law, economy, and administration. Religious legitimacy reinforced political authority, while political action reinforced religious principles. Understanding this interdependence clarifies how pharaohs governed not just by force, but through ideology, ritual, and social consensus. Diplomacy was another essential aspect of pharaonic rule. Egypt maintained trade relations, alliances, and treaties with neighbouring regions, from Nubia to the Levant. Pharaohs negotiated resource access, marriage alliances, and military cooperation, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of international politics. Popular myths that portray pharaohs as isolationist or unconcerned with external affairs obscure this strategic engagement with the wider world. Military organization reinforced political power. Pharaohs directed campaigns, defended borders, and coordinated armies, integrating strategy, logistics, and intelligence. Control over military resources allowed pharaohs to maintain stability, enforce policies, and project influence. Misconceptions of the pharaoh as a ceremonial figure neglect this critical role as both strategist and commander-in-chief. Economics was tightly linked to political authority. Pharaohs oversaw taxation, resource allocation, and large-scale projects, from irrigation works to monumental construction. Administrative records reveal careful planning, oversight, and auditing. Pharaohs needed to balance wealth distribution, labor organization, and public approval to maintain stability. Modern depictions that exaggerate oppression or magical power erase the sophisticated economic governance that underpinned Egyptian society. Art, architecture, and monumental projects served political and ideological purposes. Temples, pyramids, statues, and inscriptions were not just displays of wealth. They reinforced legitimacy, communicated achievements, and created enduring cultural memory. Pharaohs used these projects strategically to influence public perception, assert authority, and integrate religion with politics. Misinterpretation of these works as mere vanity overlooks their administrative, ideological, and communicative dimensions. Succession and family dynamics were also political instruments. Pharaohs managed dynastic continuity through marriage, alliances, and strategic appointments. These decisions were central to maintaining legitimacy, avoiding civil conflict, and consolidating power. Modern myths that simplify Pharaoh's family dynamics into intrigue or scandal obscure the deliberate, calculated nature of dynastic governance. Even ceremonial aspects like coronation rituals or religious offerings were politically significant. They visibly demonstrated authority, reinforced hierarchical order, and linked the ruler to divine principles. What modern culture interprets as spectacle was actually a functional component of governance, legitimizing authority and ensuring social cohesion. Ultimately, pharaohs were far more than mythic figures. They were administrators, strategists, diplomats, military leaders, and symbolic leaders whose power relied on a complex system of social, religious, and political integration. Misinterpreting their authority as absolute, magical, or purely ceremonial erases the intelligence, planning, and sophistication required to govern one of history's most enduring civilizations. Ancient Egypt is often portrayed as a civilization steeped in superstition, where magic and mystical rituals dominated daily life and medicine was primitive. Hollywood and popular culture present priests casting spells to cure disease, while pharaohs wield mystical powers to control reality. The truth, however, reveals a far more sophisticated understanding. Egyptian magic and medical practice were systematic, empirical, and integrated into practical knowledge, public health, and social stability. Magic, or Heka, was not an irrational practice. It was a framework for applying knowledge to influence outcomes, enforce ethical norms, and ensure social cohesion. Rituals, incantations, and protective charms were symbolic, instructional, and practical. Priests and scribes used them to encode rules, provide guidance, and manage human behavior. Modern interpretations that treat magic as purely supernatural misrepresent its function. It was a codified cultural technology designed to stabilize society and reinforce cosmic and social order. Medical practice combined observation, empirical knowledge, and ritualized procedures. Physicians, often also priests, treated injuries, infections, and ailments using herbs, bandages, and surgical techniques refined through experience. Texts like the Ebers Papyrus contain detailed instructions for treating wounds, digestive issues, and gynecological conditions. Treatments were documented, tested, and applied systematically, reflecting a proto-scientific approach rather than arbitrary guesswork. Misconceptions that Egyptians relied solely on magical charms or divine intervention overlook this empirical foundation. Amulets and protective symbols also had practical functions. They were often used as reminders for hygiene, safety, or moral behaviour, and as a way to communicate standardised principles in a highly visual and memorable manner. These objects reinforce social norms while providing psychological reassurance, demonstrating how symbolic practice could influence daily behaviour and health outcomes. Modern depictions exaggerate their mystical effect while ignoring their practical and social utility. Surgical techniques were surprisingly advanced. Egyptians performed procedures such as wound suturing, setting fractures, and treating abscesses. They combined observation of anatomy, trial and error experience, and ritualized care to improve outcomes. Instruments crafted from copper or bronze were designed for specific functions, reflecting careful attention to material properties and technique. The portrayal of Egyptian medicine as primitive ignores the sophistication and systematic methodology behind these interventions. Pharmacology was similarly empirical. Herbal remedies, mineral-based treatments, and dietary prescriptions were documented with attention to dosage, preparation, and expected effects. Recipes included anti-inflammatory herbs, analgesics, and compounds for digestive or respiratory problems. This demonstrates a methodical, experimental approach to medicine, often combined with ritual for psychological and cultural reinforcement, not magical efficacy alone. Misunderstanding these practices as purely mystical erases the rational and observational basis of Egyptian healthcare. The integration of magic and medicine illustrates a holistic worldview. Physical health, spiritual well-being, and social order were seen as interconnected. Rituals were used to reinforce adherence to hygiene, ethical conduct, and community norms, while medical interventions addressed tangible health concerns. Far from being contradictory, magic and medicine complemented each other, blending symbolism with empiricism to create functional systems for maintaining individual and societal stability. Training and knowledge transfer were institutionalized. Apprenticeships, temple schools, and written texts ensured continuity of medical and magical knowledge. Techniques were refined over generations, demonstrating an understanding of documentation, replication, and skill development. This systematic approach contradicts modern myths that depict Egyptian science as haphazard or purely mystical. Even in daily life, magical and medical practices guided practical decision-making. Protective rituals, dietary prescriptions, and health interventions were integrated into household routines, influencing behavior and promoting safety. Modern fascination with curses, spells, and supernatural claims often distracts from the structured, practical systems that underpinned Egyptian understanding of health and protection. Ultimately, what appears as magic or superstition to modern observers was actually a sophisticated combination of empirical knowledge, ritualized guidance, and social engineering. Medicine, pharmacology, and ritual function together to maintain health, order, and cohesion. Misrepresenting Egyptian science as mystical obscures the intellectual rigor, observation, and societal integration that enabled this civilization to thrive for thousands of years. Egyptian art and architecture are some of the most iconic in human history, yet modern narratives often simplify or sensationalize them. Popular imagination paints grand temples and colossal statues as mystical creations guided by divine inspiration or alien intervention, while smaller artistic works are dismissed as primitive. The truth is that Egyptian creativity combined rigorous technique, applied mathematics, and cultural symbolism, producing works that were functional, communicative, and enduring. Architecture was not purely aesthetic. Pyramids, temples, and palaces were designed with structural ingenuity that accounted for weight distribution, materials, and environmental factors. Columns, lintels, and obelisks demonstrate an understanding of physics, geometry, and long-term durability. Temples were aligned with celestial events, enhancing both symbolic significance and practical orientation. Modern myths of alien influence or supernatural construction obscure the engineering knowledge and meticulous planning that made these structures possible. Scale and proportion were carefully calculated. Pharaohs and architects employed ratios, symmetry, and visual perspective to convey power, divinity, and order. Colossal statues were not just artistic expression, they communicated authority, reinforced religious ideology, and served practical functions such as marking sacred spaces. Even smaller reliefs and wall paintings were meticulously designed to convey stories, record history, and encode religious principles, illustrating that Egyptian art was deeply integrated with communication, memory, and governance. Materials were selected for both durability and symbolic meaning. Stone, wood, pigments, and metals were chosen based on availability, function, and aesthetic or spiritual properties. Artisans understood how materials would age, respond to environmental conditions, and interact with human interaction. Modern narratives that suggest Egyptians were primitive overlook this sophisticated material science and the applied ingenuity required to transform raw resources into lasting monuments and artifacts. Relief and painting were not decorative afterthoughts, they were functional. Scenes of agriculture, ritual, and daily life documented economic activity, cultural norms, and social hierarchy. Hieroglyphs combined linguistic precision with artistic representation, allowing for communication that was both visual and textual. Art was a tool for education, governance, and spiritual alignment, not simply a display of skill or beauty. Misreading it as purely ornamental erases its integral role in sustaining civilization. Engineering and architecture were intertwined. Temples and tombs incorporated ventilation, drainage, and climate adaptation. Monumental projects required precise labour organisation, resource management, and logistical planning. Large-scale works were evidence of collaborative effort, administrative oversight, and long-term strategic thinking, rather than acts of inspiration or magic alone. Modern myths often sensationalize the mystery of construction, instead of appreciating the applied knowledge and disciplined execution involved. Innovation extended to urban design. Cities and settlements were organized to optimize movement, trade, and access to resources. Roads, canals, and storage facilities reflected careful planning and coordination. Public spaces were integrated with religious and administrative centers, reinforcing the interconnectedness of daily life, governance, and spiritual practice. Misinterpretations of Egyptian urban planning as chaotic or purely symbolic overlook the sophistication and intentionality of their design. Symbolism in art was codified and consistent. Colors, proportions, and motifs were not arbitrary. They conveyed meaning, status, and relational hierarchies. Artists adhered to strict conventions to ensure clarity and consistency across generations. Iconography encoded religious, political, and ethical concepts, creating visual systems that communicated complex ideas efficiently. Modern depictions that treat Egyptian imagery as exotic or whimsical obscure the methodical reasoning and cultural literacy embedded in each creation. Even monumental construction reflected economic and social planning. Mobilizing labor, transporting materials, and coordinating artisans required bureaucratic oversight and practical management. Projects were phased, resources allocated strategically, and progress monitored systematically. Modern myths attributing monumental works to supernatural forces or slave armies erase the human ingenuity, discipline, and organizational skill behind these achievements. Ultimately, Egyptian art and architecture were not separate from knowledge, science, or society. They integrated engineering, mathematics, material science, communication, and cultural ideology into tangible, enduring forms. Misreading these works as mystical, alien, or primitive diminishes the intellectual and practical brilliance that allowed Egyptian civilization to leave a legacy still admired and studied today. Popular culture often portrays ancient Egyptians as either grand, pharaoh-centered elites or enslaved laborers building pyramids. Movies and novels exaggerate extremes, ignoring the complexity of daily life for the majority of the population. Ordinary Egyptians, farmers, artisans, merchants and labourers, lived lives deeply structured by economy, religion, family and community, with nuanced social organisation that modern narratives often overlook. Work was diverse and highly specialised. Farmers cultivated grain, flax and vegetables, managing irrigation and storage systems that required knowledge of the Nile's seasonal cycles. Artisans produced pottery, jewellery, tools, and furniture using sophisticated techniques in metalwork, ceramics, and woodworking. Scribes recorded transactions, laws, and religious texts with precision, sustaining administration and cultural memory. Each role contributed to the functioning of society, illustrating the interdependence of skill, labour, and knowledge. Misconceptions reduce these roles to generic peasant labour, erasing the technical and cultural expertise involved. Family and social structures were complex. Households organised labour, childcare and resource management, while extended families shared obligations and inheritance. Marriage and kinship were regulated by law, custom and religion, ensuring stability and continuity. Children were educated through apprenticeship, observation and ritual participation, learning practical skills, social norms and moral principles from an early age. Modern portrayals that focus solely on elite families ignore the rich texture of ordinary life that sustained civilization. Religion permeated daily activities. People made offerings, observed rituals, and respected local deities as part of ordinary routines. Spiritual practice was not a distant or mystical activity. It was integrated into farming, craft, and commerce. Household shrines, protective amulets, and local festivals reinforced moral guidance, social cohesion, and a sense of collective responsibility. Modern interpretations often exaggerate mysticism or supernatural belief, failing to capture the practical and symbolic function of religion in organising everyday life. Trade and economy were dynamic and sophisticated. Markets, barter systems, and long-distance trade networks connected villages, cities, and foreign regions. Goods range from grain and textiles to jewellery, metals, and exotic imports like incense or lapis lazuli. Merchants coordinated production, transportation, and exchange, creating complex logistical systems. Popular myths often depict Egyptian trade as static or primitive, but it relied on careful planning, negotiation, and understanding of supply and demand. Education and literacy were highly valued. Beyond scribes and priests, knowledge of mathematics, writing, and ritual practice extended to skilled workers and administrators. Record-keeping, measurement, and technical knowledge were essential for agriculture, construction, and trade. This widespread application of literacy and technical expertise contradicts modern myths that reduce ancient Egyptians to uneducated labourers. Clothing, diet, and housing reveal attention to functionality and comfort. Linen garments were suited to the hot climate, while homes were designed for ventilation, light, and practical organisation. Meals included bread, vegetables, fish, and beer, reflecting seasonal availability and nutritional balance. Modern depictions of exotic luxury or extreme deprivation distort these carefully adapted practices that balanced environment, resources, and social norms. Leisure and socialisation were integral. Music, storytelling, games, and community gatherings provided relaxation, education, and social reinforcement. Festivals, dances, and communal rituals strengthened identity and cohesion. Far from being idle or oppressed, Egyptians engaged in structured recreational and cultural activities that reinforced both skill and societal values. Legal and administrative systems ensured order. Disputes were mediated, contracts enforced, and property rights maintained. Laws regulated labour, inheritance, commerce, and morality, embedding structure and predictability into daily life. Misrepresenting Egyptian society as chaotic or tyrannical ignores the governance frameworks that allowed complex communities to function effectively. Understanding daily life in its full complexity challenges the extremes of modern myth. Egyptians were neither passive slaves nor indulgent elites. They were skilled, knowledgeable, socially integrated, and culturally sophisticated. Appreciating the full spectrum of social roles, responsibilities, and practices reveals a civilization sustained by human ingenuity, cooperation, and practical wisdom across generations. Egypt's legacy is often viewed through the lens of grand monuments, golden treasures, and mystical achievements. Movies, novels, and pop culture have amplified myths about pyramids, pharaohs, curses, and gods, often emphasizing spectacle over substance. The reality is more profound. Egypt's influence endured for millennia because of its integration of governance, religion, economy, technology, and culture. Misinterpretations today obscure the true genius that allowed this civilization to thrive for over 3,000 years. One of the most persistent myths is that Egyptians relied purely on superstition or magic to achieve their accomplishments. In reality, every aspect of society, architecture, medicine, agriculture, and administration, was grounded in observation, empirical knowledge, and systematic planning. Rituals and religion were not irrational indulgences. They were frameworks for education, social cohesion, and ethical guidance. Modern portrayals that sensationalize curses, spells, and mystical events reduce a complex civilization to fantasy. The legacy of governance is equally misunderstood. Pharaohs were more than ceremonial figures or autocrats. They maintained sophisticated bureaucracies, coordinated large-scale projects, and balanced diplomacy, military strategy, and religious authority. Temples, tombs, and monuments were not only symbolic, they reinforced social order, facilitated economic management, and codified cultural memory. Misinterpretation of pharaohs as either omnipotent tyrants or mystical beings ignores the nuanced political and administrative intelligence that sustained the state for centuries. Art, writing, and architecture contributed to cultural continuity and influence. Hieroglyphs preserved knowledge, law, and history. Temples and monuments transmitted ideology and civic memory, and artistic conventions encoded social norms, ethical principles, and spiritual beliefs. These achievements were not mere spectacle. They were systems of communication and organization that informed subsequent civilizations. Modern myths that emphasize alien influence, secret codes, or supernatural inspiration obscure human ingenuity and disciplined craftsmanship. Egyptian science, medicine, and technology are often dismissed as primitive or mystical. In reality, Egyptians applied empirical observation, trial and error, and systematic documentation to medicine, agriculture, engineering, and astronomy. Knowledge of anatomy, pharmacology, irrigation, and construction demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of natural and human systems. Modern misconceptions that reduce this knowledge to magical thinking erase the intellectual rigor that enabled the civilization to function effectively. Economy and labor were equally sophisticated. Resource management, trade networks, taxation, and labor organization allowed Egypt to sustain monumental construction, maintain urban centers, and support religious and administrative institutions. Ordinary citizens, artisans, and scribes were active participants in a complex interdependent system. Misrepresenting Egyptian labor as either enslaved servitude or indulgent luxury overlooks the structured, skilled, and socially integrated workforce that supported every achievement. Education and social transmission were foundational. Temples, scribal schools, and apprenticeships ensured that knowledge was preserved, refined, and disseminated across generations. Literacy, technical expertise, and ritual practice enabled continuity in administration, religion, and culture. Modern myths often ignore these mechanisms, focusing instead on dramatic legends that distort the practical and intellectual systems underlying Egyptian civilization. Even myths about the afterlife and spiritual practice were functional, not frivolous. Rituals, tomb construction, and funerary goods reflected social organization, economic coordination, and moral instruction. The mystery of curses, elaborate burials, or magical spells is largely a product of sensationalized storytelling. In reality, these practices reinforced ethical conduct, societal stability, and cultural identity across centuries. The enduring fascination with Egypt stems from both its visible grandeur and its misinterpreted mysteries. Pyramids, temples, mummies, and hieroglyphs are visually striking, inviting myths, speculation, and exaggeration. Yet understanding Egypt on its own terms, its integrated systems of governance, religion, economy, science, and culture, reveals an unparalleled human achievement, a civilization that combined practical intelligence, spiritual insight, and artistic expression to endure for millennia. Modern myths obscure this legacy, but the real story is more inspiring than any fiction. Egyptians didn't rely on magic, aliens, or supernatural intervention. They built systems that harmonized human ingenuity with natural and social laws. Their legacy persists not merely in monuments, but in the enduring principles of organization, observation, creativity, and cultural cohesion. Misunderstood influence often fuels curiosity, but true appreciation requires recognizing the discipline, intellect, and vision embedded in every aspect of Egyptian life. In studying Egypt, we find a civilization that transcends superficial spectacle. Its achievements were real, measurable, and profoundly human, offering lessons in resilience, integration, and innovation. By separating myth from reality, we honor the intelligence, skill, and vision of a people whose influence continues to resonate thousands of years later. Modern imagination may embellish the story, but the truth, complex, disciplined, and inspiring, is far more remarkable. So, you've just travelled through 5,000 years of history, and maybe unlearned a few things along the way. If tonight's journey stirred your curiosity, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember, history doesn't just live in the past. Sometimes it waits for us to remember it right.